The child you remember being is dead. Not as a metaphor, not as a poetic way of speaking about the passage of time, but as a literal fact about the matter that constitutes your body. Almost every atom that made up the child you once were has been flushed out of your body and replaced. The carbon and the oxygen and the nitrogen that composed that child's flesh dispersed back into the world and exchanged for other atoms that were, not long ago, part of the air and the water and the food around you. The body reading these words contains almost nothing of the body that was you when you were 7 years old. The cells have been broken down and rebuilt, the molecules synthesized and degraded, the matter exchanged so thoroughly that, at the level of the physical substance, you are not the same object that you were. That child is, in the most literal material sense, gone. There is no funeral for this death, no grave, no mourning, because the replacement happened so gradually, so seamlessly, that you never noticed it, the matter of the child being carried away and replaced atom by atom, cell by cell, across the years, while the sense of being a continuous self remained unbroken, so that you experience yourself as the same person who was that child, even though the matter that was that child is entirely gone. The atoms that were that child are now dispersed across the world, in the soil and the air and the water, and perhaps in the bodies of other living things, scattered and recombined, no longer gathered into the form of that child, and yet you feel yourself to be that child grown up, the same continuous person. The sense of continuity, persisting unbroken across the total replacement of the matter. And the question that this raises is one of the most disturbing that a human being can ask. If the matter that constituted you has been entirely replaced, in what sense are you the same person who once was that child? And in what sense did that child survive at all? The contemporary science of cellular biology has established the rate at which the matter of the body is replaced, and the findings are more extreme than most people imagine. The biologist Jonas Frisén at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm developed an ingenious method for dating the age of human cells using the carbon, 1,4 left in the atmosphere by nuclear weapons testing in the 1950s and 1960s, and his findings, published in the journal Cell in 2005, established that the cells of the adult human body have an average age far younger than the age of the person, with many cell populations being replaced on timescales of days, weeks, months, or years. Frisén's method exploited a remarkable accident of history. The fact that the above-ground nuclear weapons tests of the mid-20th century released a pulse of carbon, 1,4 into the atmosphere that was then incorporated into the molecules of every living thing, including the DNA of newly formed cells, so that the level of carbon 14 inches, a cell's DNA, serves as a date stamp marking the time when the cell was formed. By measuring the carbon 14 inches, the DNA of cells from various tissues, Frisén and his collaborators were able to determine when those cells had been formed, and the findings established that the body is, in a sense, far younger than the person who inhabits it, with most of the cells having been formed long after the person's birth, the matter of the body continuously replaced across the span of the life. The findings revealed that different tissues are replaced at strikingly different rates, with some tissues turning over rapidly and others more slowly, but with the overall picture being one of a body that is, on average, far younger than the person, the great majority of the body's cells having been formed within the recent past rather than persisting from the person's birth. The work established with empirical precision what had previously been a matter of inference, that the body is not a stable structure laid down once and retained, but a thing in continuous turnover, the cells being formed and replaced across the span of the life, so that the body of the present is composed of matter that was not part of the body of the past. The contemplative traditions arrived at their own recognition that the self that endures is not the material body, that the body is a thing that changes and passes, while what is essential about the person is something other than the specific matter The recognition that the contemplative traditions developed through the examination of the changing nature of the body and the question of what, if anything, persists through the change. The relationship between the contemporary scientific finding that the matter of the body is continuously replaced and the contemplative recognition that the self is not the material body is striking, even as the contemporary science articulates the replacement in the terms of the cellular biology, while the contemplative traditions articulate the persistence of the self in the terms of the soul or the deeper reality, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The contemporary science establishes the fact of the replacement, the relentless turnover of the matter that constitutes the body, the finding that the atoms and molecules and cells are continuously exchanged so that the body is, at the level of its material substance, a different body than it was. The contemplative traditions, examining the same changing body through the lens of contemplative reflection, arrived at the recognition that the self cannot be the changing body, that what is essential about the person must be something other than the matter that is continuously replaced, and they articulated this something other through the frameworks of the soul and the deeper self that the subsequent stages of this investigation will examine. That the contemporary science and the contemplative traditions both arrived at the recognition that the self is not simply the material body. The science, through the empirical finding of the replacement of the matter, and the traditions, through the contemplative reflection on the changing nature of the body, is a striking convergence, even as the two articulate the recognition in their different terms, and the relationship between them remains a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. You are a letter being rewritten, word by word, until none of the original remains, and yet it is still called the same letter. Consider what this means. A letter that is copied over and over, each copy replacing a few words of the previous one, until after enough copies not a single word of the original document remains, is in one sense an entirely new document, and in another sense the same letter that it always was, the continuity residing not in the specific words, but in the pattern that each copy preserves, even as the material is replaced. The words are different, the paper is different, the ink is different, and yet the letter is recognizably the same letter, carrying the same meaning, saying the same thing, because what makes it that letter is not the specific physical marks, but the pattern that the marks express, the pattern that has been carried forward through all the copies, even as every physical trace of the original has been replaced. You are like this letter, though incomparably more complex, the matter that constitutes you being continuously replaced while something about the pattern persists, the specific arrangement that makes you recognizably the same person even as the material is exchanged. And yet, as with the letter, there is a disturbing question lurking beneath the apparent continuity, the question of whether the pattern that persists is truly the same pattern or has itself been changed, slowly and continuously, with each copying, so that the letter that is called the same letter is in fact saying something subtly different from what the original said, the changes accumulating across the copies until the meaning itself has drifted, even as the letter is still called by the same name. The contemporary science has established the specific rates at which the various tissues of the body are replaced, and the picture that emerges is one of relentless turnover. The cells that line the surface of the stomach and the intestine are replaced every few days, worn away by the harsh chemistry of digestion and continuously rebuilt. The lining of the gut, exposed to the acids and enzymes that break down food, is among the most rapidly replaced tissues in the body. The cells living only a matter of days before they are sloughed off and replaced by new cells formed beneath them, so that the surface that meets the food you eat is almost entirely renewed within a week. The cells of the skin are replaced across a cycle of weeks, the outer layer continuously shed and renewed, the skin you have now being, not the skin you had a month ago, the old cells continuously flaking away as dust while new cells are formed beneath. The red blood cells circulate for about 4 months before they are broken down and replaced. The blood that carries oxygen through your body being continuously renewed, the cells formed in the marrow of your bones and removed when they wear out. Even the cells of the skeleton, which seem so permanent, so much the very image of what endures, are continuously broken down by cells called osteoclasts and rebuilt by cells called osteoblasts, with the adult skeleton being substantially replaced across a cycle of about 10 years. The bone that seems the very emblem of permanence, the part of the body that remains when all the soft tissue has decayed, the skeleton that we imagine as the enduring frame of the self, is itself in constant turnover, the old bone continuously dissolved, and the new bone continuously laid down, so that the skeleton you carry now is not the skeleton you carried a decade ago, the very bones having been replaced. There is almost nothing in the body that is exempt from this turnover, almost nothing that remains from the body of years ago, the matter of the body being continuously carried away and replaced across every tissue and every system, so that the body is less a fixed object than a standing wave, a pattern maintained through the ceaseless flow of matter through it. The contemplative traditions recognize that the body is a thing in constant flux, that the body the person inhabits is not a fixed and permanent possession, but a changing process, and that the attachment to the body as the self is therefore a kind of error, a misidentification of the changing for the permanent. The relationship between the contemporary scientific understanding of the constant replacement of the tissues of the body and the contemplative recognition of the body as a thing in constant flux is striking, even as the contemporary science articulates the flux in the terms of the cellular turnover, while the contemplative traditions articulate it in the terms of the impermanence of the body, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition of the impermanence of the body, the recognition that the body the person inhabits is not a fixed possession but a thing in constant change, runs through the contemplative traditions, which counseled the recognition that the attachment to the body as the permanent self is a misidentification of the changing for the permanent, the body being a thing that arises and changes and passes, rather than a fixed and enduring possession. That the contemplative traditions recognize the body as a thing in constant flux, and that the contemporary science has established the relentless turnover of the cells and molecules that constitute the body, is a striking relationship, even as the traditions understood the flux in the terms of the impermanence of the body, and the science understands it in the terms of the cellular turnover, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. The question of what it means to be the same person across the replacement of the matter is one of the oldest in philosophy, and it was articulated with particular clarity through the ancient puzzle of the ship that is rebuilt plank by plank. The puzzle, which has come down to us from the ancient Greek tradition and which is associated with the historian Plutarch, who recorded it in his Life of Theseus around the beginning of the 2nd century of the Common Era, asks whether a ship whose planks are replaced one by one until none of the original planks remain is still the same ship. Plutarch recorded that the ship in which the legendary hero Theseus had returned to Athens was preserved by the Athenians, who replaced the planks as they decayed, removing the old timbers and putting new ones in their place, until the question arose among the philosophers whether the ship that remained, with all its planks replaced, was still the ship of Theseus, or had become a different ship, the very puzzle that the replacement of the matter of your body raises about you. The puzzle has been examined and debated across the subsequent history of philosophy, and it bears directly on the question of what you are, since your body, like the ship, has had its material components replaced until almost none of the original remains. The puzzle was sharpened by later philosophers, including the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, who asked what would happen if the old planks, as they were removed, were gathered up and reassembled into a second ship, so that there would be two ships, one with continuity of structure, but none of the original matter, and one with all of the original matter, but no continuity of structure, the question of which is the true ship of Theseus, capturing the depth of the puzzle about what makes a thing the same thing across time. The version that Hobbes proposed sharpens the puzzle into a genuine dilemma, since each of the two ships has a claim to be the original, the one through the continuity of its structure and the gradual replacement of its parts, the other through its possession of all the original matter, and there is no obvious way to decide between the claims. The puzzle revealing that our ordinary notion of what makes a thing the same thing across time does not give a clear answer when the matter and the continuity of structure come apart. The puzzle applies to you with particular force, since in your case the matter has been replaced while the continuity of structure has been preserved, so that you are like the ship with continuity of structure, but none of the original matter, the question of whether you are the same person who was that child, being the question of whether the continuity of the structure, the pattern, is sufficient for sameness, or whether the loss of the original matter means that you are, strictly speaking, a different person who has inherited the pattern of the child. If the ship whose planks have all been replaced is not the same ship, then you, whose atoms have all been replaced, are not the same person who was that child. If the ship is nonetheless the same ship, then the sameness must reside in something other than the specific material components, in the pattern or the form or the continuity of the structure, rather than in the matter itself. The contemplative traditions arrived at their own versions of this puzzle, recognizing that the body is replaced and changed while the person is in some sense continuous, and articulating the continuity in the terms of the soul, or the deeper self that persists through the changes of the body. The relationship between the philosophical puzzle of the ship and the contemplative recognition of the persistence of the self through the changes of the body is striking. Even as the philosophical puzzle articulates the question in the terms of the identity of the material object, while the contemplative traditions articulate the persistence in the terms of the soul, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection, rather than something that the traditions or the philosophy themselves establish. The puzzle of the ship and the puzzle of the self are, at bottom, the same puzzle. The puzzle of what makes a thing the same thing across time, when the matter that constitutes it has been replaced, and the contemplative traditions, confronting the same puzzle as it applies to the human person, located the sameness not in the material body, which changes, but in the soul or the deeper self, which they held to persist through the changes of the body. That the philosophical puzzle of the ship locates the question of identity in something other than the specific matter, and that the contemplative traditions located the persistence of the person in the soul, or the deeper self rather than the changing body, is a striking relationship, even as the puzzle articulates the question in the terms of the material object and the traditions articulated in the terms of the soul, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. The matter that constitutes you is not only replaced but is, while it is part of you, in a state of constant turnover at the molecular level, with the very molecules that perform the functions of life being continuously synthesized and broken down. The contemporary science of molecular biology has established that the proteins that perform the work of the body, the enzymes that catalyze the reactions of metabolism, the structural proteins that give the cells their form, the signaling molecules that coordinate the functions of the body, are continuously synthesized and degraded, with the specific molecules being replaced on timescales that range from minutes to days, even as the patterns they form persist. The discovery that the molecules of the body are in constant turnover was established through the work of the biochemist Rudolf Schoenheimer at Columbia University in the late 1930s, who used isotopes to label the molecules that animals consumed and trace their fate through the body, establishing that the molecules of the body are not stable structures laid down once and retained, but are in a state of continuous synthesis and degradation. the molecules being constantly broken down and replaced even in the tissues that appear most stable. Schoenheimer articulated this discovery through the phrase, "the dynamic state of body constituents," the title of the lectures he gave summarizing his work. The recognition that the body is not a static structure, but a dynamic process in which the molecules are continuously turned over. Before Schoenheimer's work, the prevailing assumption had been that the molecules of the body, once incorporated, remained largely in place, with the body being understood as a relatively stable structure that was maintained by replacing only what was lost to wear and damage. Schoenheimer's work overturned this assumption, establishing that the molecules of the body are in constant flux even in the absence of any wear or damage, that the body is continuously tearing itself down and rebuilding itself at the molecular level, the molecules being synthesized and degraded in a ceaseless turnover that has no purpose beyond the maintenance of the dynamic state itself. The recognition was startling in its time and remains startling when its implications are fully grasped. The recognition that the body is not a thing that is built and then maintained, but a process that is continuously rebuilding itself. The molecules flowing through the pattern of the body like water through the pattern of a standing wave. The structure of the body is maintained not as a static arrangement of fixed components, but as a dynamic pattern through which the molecules flow, synthesized and degraded and replaced, with the pattern persisting through the flow rather than residing in any fixed material. The contemplative traditions recognize that life is a process rather than a fixed thing, that the living being is something that is continuously renewed and maintained rather than a static object that simply persists, and that the principle of life is therefore something other than the specific material components, a dynamic principle of organization rather than a fixed substance. The relationship between the contemporary scientific understanding of the constant molecular turnover that maintains the body and the contemplative recognition of life as a dynamic process rather than a fixed thing is striking, even as the contemporary science articulates the turnover in the terms of the synthesis and degradation of molecules, while the contemplative traditions articulate the dynamic principle of life in the terms of the vital principle or the soul, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that life is a process rather than a fixed thing, that the living being is continuously maintained and renewed rather than simply persisting as a static object, runs through the contemplative traditions, which understood the living being as animated by a dynamic principle of life rather than as a fixed material structure. That the contemplative traditions understood life as a dynamic process maintained by a vital principle, and that the contemporary science has established the constant molecular turnover that maintains the living body, is a striking relationship, even as the traditions understood the dynamic principle in the terms of the vital principle, or the soul, and the science understands the turnover in the terms of the synthesis and degradation of molecules, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. The recognition that the matter of the body is continuously replaced raises the question of where, in all this flux, the self is to be located. If you are not the specific matter, which is continuously replaced, then what are you? This is the question that the relentless turnover of the body forces upon us, the question that cannot be evaded once the fact of the replacement is recognized. You point to your body and say, "This is me." And yet the body you point to today is not the body you would have pointed to as a child, the matter having been entirely replaced, so that the me you are pointing to cannot be the matter, which has changed, but must be something else, something that has persisted through the change of the matter. The contemporary science suggests that what persists is not the matter but the pattern, the specific arrangement of information that organizes whatever matter happens to constitute you at any given moment, the pattern that is maintained through the replacement of the material. The recognition that what is essential about you is the pattern rather than the matter is one that bears directly on the question of what you are and of whether the child you remember being survived at all. If what is essential is the pattern, and if the pattern has been continuously maintained through the replacement of the matter, then there is a sense in which you are continuous with that child, the pattern having been preserved through the changes of the material. But here the disturbing question deepens rather than resolves, because the pattern itself has changed, slowly and continuously, across the years that separate you from that child, so that the pattern that is you now is not the same pattern that was that child, and the question of whether you are the same person becomes the question of whether a continuously changing pattern can be the same pattern across the changes. The child's pattern and your pattern are connected by a continuous chain of small changes, each change so small that it preserved the sense of continuity, but the changes accumulating across the years until the pattern that is you now differs profoundly from the pattern that was that child in the body and the brain and the very structure of the self, so that the continuity that connects you to that child is a continuity of gradual change rather than of sameness. The same kind of continuity that connects the rewritten letter to the original, even after every word has been changed. Whether this continuity of gradual change is enough to make you the same person who was that child, or whether it means that the child has been gradually replaced by a succession of slightly different persons until the person who is you now is genuinely different from the child, is the question that the replacement of both the matter and the pattern forces upon us. The contemplative traditions arrived at their own recognition that what is essential about the person is not the material body but a deeper principle, whether understood as the soul or the deeper self, or the pattern of the person, and that this deeper principle is what persists through the changes of the body. The relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition that what is essential is the pattern rather than the matter, and the contemplative recognition that what is essential is the deeper principle rather than the material body is striking, even as the contemporary science articulates the essential principle in the terms of the pattern of information, while the contemplative traditions articulate it in the terms of the soul or the deeper self. And any bridge between them is a matter for reflection, rather than something that the science itself establishes. Both the contemporary science and the contemplative traditions, confronting the fact that the matter of the body is replaced while the person is in some sense continuous, located the continuity in something other than the matter, the science in the pattern that organizes the matter, and the traditions in the soul or the deeper self that persists through the changes of the body, the convergence on the recognition that what is essential about the person is not the changing matter, but a deeper principle that persists through the change. That the contemplative traditions located the essential principle of the person in the soul or the deeper self rather than the changing body, and that the contemporary science has located what is essential in the pattern rather than the matter, is a striking relationship, even as the traditions understood the essential principle in the terms of the soul and the science understands it in the terms of the pattern of information, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. The investigation that this opening has begun will be developed across the subsequent stages, which will examine more closely the nature of the pattern that persists through the replacement of the matter, the question of whether the pattern itself is stable or is continuously reconstructed, and the frameworks that the great philosophical and contemplative traditions of the West and the East have developed for understanding what persists through the changes of the body. The recognition with which this stage began, the recognition that the child you remember being is, at the level of the matter, gone, that the body has replaced itself so thoroughly that almost nothing of that child remains, is a recognition that the contemporary science has established beyond serious doubt, and it is a recognition that forces the question of what you are, of whether you are the same person who was that child or something else, something that came after and inherited the memories and the pattern of that child while the matter of that child was carried away. The contemplative traditions, confronting the same changing body, arrived at the recognition that the self cannot be the matter that changes, and they developed the frameworks of the soul and the deeper self to articulate what persists through the change. frameworks that the subsequent stages of this investigation will examine. The next stage will examine the pattern more closely, the recognition that what is essential about you is the pattern rather than the matter, and the disturbing question of whether the pattern itself is as stable as it seems or is continuously reconstructed in ways that raise even deeper questions about what you are. The next stage will examine in particular the recognition that the pattern that constitutes you is not a fixed and stable thing that simply persists through the replacement of the matter, but is itself continuously maintained and reconstructed, raising the question of whether the continuity of the self is as solid as it seems, or is itself a kind of construction, the question that deepens the disturbance that this stage has opened. The subsequent stages will examine the frameworks that the great contemplative traditions of the West and the East have developed for understanding what persists through the changes of the body, the Christian and Greek and Jewish frameworks of the soul, the Hindu and Buddhist and Taoist frameworks of the self and the non-self, and the synthesis of all that the investigation has explored. The recognition that the matter of the body is continuously replaced, that the child you remember being is, in the most literal material sense, gone, and that what persists, if anything persists, is not the matter, but the pattern, is the recognition that opens the investigation into what you are. The child you remember being is dead, and the question of whether anything of that child survived, of whether you are the same person or merely what came after. The child you remember being is dead, and the question of whether anything of that child survived, of whether you are the same person or merely what came after, wearing the memories of that child like inherited clothes, is the question that the investigation will examine, the question of what you are at the deepest level, beneath the matter that has been replaced and the pattern that has changed. The investigation continues. If you are not the matter, then you are the pattern, and the pattern is not as stable as you think. The previous stage left you here, at the recognition that you cannot be the matter that is continuously replaced, that what is essential about you must be the pattern that persists through the replacement of the matter. The recognition that the matter of your body is continuously replaced led, at the close of the previous stage, to the recognition that what is essential about you cannot be the matter, which changes, but must be the pattern, the specific arrangement that is maintained through the replacement of the material. This recognition might seem to offer a refuge, a place to locate the self that is safe from the relentless replacement of the matter, the pattern persisting while the matter flows through it, the way the pattern of a wave persists while the water that constitutes it is continuously replaced. But the pattern offers no refuge from the disturbance, because the pattern itself is not a fixed and stable thing that simply persists while the matter flows through it. The pattern is itself continuously maintained, continuously rebuilt, continuously reconstructed, and the disturbing question that this stage will examine is whether the pattern that you take to be the stable core of your identity is as solid as it seems, or whether it too is a kind of ongoing construction, a letter that is being rewritten even at the level of the pattern, so that not only the matter, but the very pattern that organizes the matter is in flux. The letter that is rewritten word by word until none of the original remains is still called the same letter. But if the words themselves are changing with each copying, if the meaning is drifting even as the letter is preserved, then the sameness of the letter becomes a far more questionable thing. The contemporary science of how the pattern of the self is maintained in the brain and the body has established that the pattern is not a fixed structure, but a dynamic process, continuously maintained and continuously modified, and the findings bear directly on the question of whether you are the same person who was that child or something that has been continuously reconstructed across the years. The contemplative traditions arrived at their own recognition that the self is not a fixed thing but a process, that the apparent stability of the self conceals a continuous flux, that what seems to be a permanent and unchanging core is in fact something continuously arising and passing. The recognition that the contemplative traditions developed through the examination of the self in contemplative practice. The relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition that the pattern of the self is continuously maintained and reconstructed, and the contemplative recognition that the self is a process rather than a fixed thing, is striking. Even as the contemporary science articulates the reconstruction in the terms of the dynamics of the brain and the body, while the contemplative traditions articulate the flux of the self in the terms of the impermanence of all things, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that the self is not a fixed thing but a continuous process runs through the contemplative traditions, which counseled the close examination of the self and found, in that examination, not a fixed and permanent core, but a continuous flux, a process of arising and passing that the appearance of a permanent self conceals. That the contemplative traditions recognize the self as a process rather than a fixed thing, and that the contemporary science has established that the pattern of the self is continuously maintained and reconstructed, is a striking relationship. Even as the traditions understood the flux of the self in the terms of the impermanence of all things, and the science understands it in the terms of the dynamics of the brain and the body, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. The pattern that constitutes you is, more fundamentally than anything else, a pattern of information, and the contemporary understanding of the relationship between information and the physical substrate that carries it bears directly on the question of what you are. What makes you the specific person you are is not the specific atoms that constitute you, which are interchangeable with any other atoms of the same kind, one carbon atom being indistinguishable from another, but the specific way the atoms are arranged, the pattern of organization that the atoms happen to instantiate, the information that the arrangement embodies. The recognition that what is essential about a physical structure is the information rather than the specific material substrate emerged through more than a century of work on the relationship between information and physical processes, work that established that the organization of any physical system can be characterized in terms of the information that it embodies, and that the information is of a different nature than the specific material components that carry it. The mathematician Claude Shannon, working at Bell Laboratories, established in his 1948 paper, A Mathematical Theory of Communication, the precise measure of information, the measure that quantifies the information content of a system in terms of the reduction of uncertainty that it produces, the measure that turned out to share the mathematical form of the entropy that the physicists had developed for thermodynamics. Shannon's work, developed in the context of the problem of transmitting messages through communication channels, established that information could be measured precisely, that it was a definite quantity that could be characterized mathematically, and that it was a feature of the pattern or the arrangement rather than of the specific physical medium that carried it, the same message being transmissible through wires or radio waves or any other medium capable of carrying the pattern. The recognition that information is separable from the specific medium that carries it, that the same pattern of information can be instantiated in different physical substrates, was among the most consequential of the 20th century, providing the foundation for the digital technologies that have transformed human civilization and bearing, when its implications are followed through, on the question of what you are. A piece of music can be carried by the grooves of a record, the magnetic patterns of a tape, the pits of a compact disc, or the digital code of a file, the same music being preserved through entirely different physical media, because what makes it that piece of music is not the specific medium but the pattern of information that the medium carries. So too, the recognition suggests, what makes you the specific person you are might be not the specific matter, but the pattern of information, the pattern that has been carried by the continuously replaced matter of your body across the years. The work established that the information that a system embodies can be precisely characterized, that it is a feature of the organization of the system rather than of the specific material components, and that the same information can in principle be carried by different material substrates, the pattern being separable, at least conceptually, from the specific matter that carries it. The recognition bears directly on the question of what you are, since if what is essential about you is the pattern of information rather than the matter, then the replacement of the matter need not threaten the continuity of the self, the pattern being preserved through the replacement of the material that carries it. This recognition seems, at first, to resolve the disturbance that the previous stage opened, since it locates the self not in the matter, which is replaced, but in the pattern, which can be preserved through the replacement of the matter, the way a melody can be preserved through the replacement of the specific instruments that play it, or a story through the replacement of the specific copies of the book that contain it. If you are the pattern rather than the matter, then the replacement of the matter is no threat to who you are, the pattern persisting through the flow of the matter, the continuity of the self residing in the continuity of the pattern. But this resolution holds only if the pattern itself is stable, only if the pattern that is preserved through the replacement of the matter is itself a fixed and unchanging thing. And the disturbing recognition of this stage is that the pattern is not stable, that it too is in continuous flux, so that the refuge that the pattern seemed to offer turns out to be no refuge at all. The contemplative traditions arrived at their own recognition that what is essential about the person is the form or the pattern rather than the specific matter, that the person is constituted by an organizing principle that is of a different nature than the material body. The recognition that the contemplative traditions developed through the examination of the relationship between the soul, or the form, and the material body. The relationship between the contemporary scientific understanding of the pattern as information separable from the material substrate and the contemplative understanding of the form or the soul as the organizing principle distinct from the material body is striking, even as the contemporary science articulates the pattern in the terms of information, while the contemplative traditions articulate it in the terms of the form or the soul, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that what is essential about a thing is its form or pattern, rather than its specific matter, runs back through the contemplative and philosophical traditions, the Aristotelian tradition having articulated the form as the principle that makes the matter into a specific kind of thing, and the contemplative traditions having articulated the soul as the form that organizes the body, the organizing principle being understood as of a different nature than the matter that it organizes. That the contemplative and philosophical traditions located what is essential about a thing in its form or pattern rather than its matter, and that the contemporary science has established that information is a feature of the pattern separable from the specific material substrate, is a striking relationship. Even as the traditions understood the essential principle in the terms of the form or the soul, and the science understands it in the terms of information, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. The pattern of the self is encoded, in substantial part, in the connections among the neurons of the brain, the specific pattern of synaptic connections that constitutes the structure through which the brain produces the mind. And the contemporary science has established that this pattern is not fixed, but is continuously modified throughout the life. The brain contains some 86 billion neurons, each connected to thousands of others through the synapses that allow the neurons to communicate, the whole forming a pattern of connections of staggering complexity. And it is this pattern of connections, more than any specific matter, that encodes who you are, the memories and the skills and the dispositions and the very structure of your mind. If the pattern of connections is what encodes the self, then the question of whether the self is stable becomes the question of whether the pattern of connections is stable, and the contemporary science has established that it is not, that the pattern of connections is continuously modified throughout the life. The neuroscientist Eric Kandel, whose research at Columbia University earned him the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2000, established the cellular and molecular mechanisms by which the connections among neurons are modified by experience. The mechanisms of learning and memory through which the pattern of the brain is continuously reshaped. Kandel's research, conducted across decades and using the marine snail Aplysia as a model organism because of the relative simplicity of its nervous system, established the molecular processes by which the connections among neurons are strengthened or weakened by experience, the processes through which the brain learns and remembers, the processes that continuously reshape the pattern of connections that constitutes the structure of the brain. The relative simplicity of the snail's nervous system, with its large and identifiable neurons, allowed Kandel to work out in detail the molecular mechanisms by which experience modifies the connections among neurons, mechanisms that subsequent research established to operate in the same essential ways in the vastly more complex nervous systems of human beings. The work established that learning is not merely the storage of information in an unchanging structure, but the physical modification of the structure of the brain, the connections among neurons being strengthened or weakened or formed or eliminated by experience, so that the brain is physically reshaped by what the person learns and experiences, the very structure of the brain being a record of the person's history that is continuously rewritten. Kandel's research established that the strength of the connections among neurons changes with experience, that the very structure of the brain is modified by what the person experiences and learns, so that the pattern of the brain is not a fixed structure laid down once and retained, but a continuously modified pattern that is reshaped throughout the life. The brain that you carry now is not, at the level of its specific pattern of connections, the brain that you carried as a child, the connections having been continuously modified by everything you have experienced and learned, so that the pattern of the brain, like the matter of the body, has been continuously reshaped across the years. The recognition bears directly on the question of whether the pattern that is you is stable, since if the pattern of the brain is continuously modified by experience, then the pattern that is you now is not the pattern that was that child, the pattern having been continuously reshaped across the years, the connections among the neurons modified by everything you have experienced and learned and felt. The contemplative traditions arrived at their own recognition that the self is shaped by experience, that the impressions left by experience accumulate and shape the person, that the self is not a fixed thing, but is continuously formed by what the person undergoes, the recognition that the contemplative traditions developed through the examination of how the self is shaped by experience and action. The relationship between the contemporary scientific understanding of the continuous modification of the pattern of the brain by experience and the contemplative understanding of the self as continuously shaped by experience is striking, even as the contemporary science articulates the modification in the terms of the changing connections among neurons, while the contemplative traditions articulate the shaping of the self in the terms of the impressions left by experience, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that the self is shaped and reshaped by experience, that the impressions left by what the person undergoes accumulate and form the person, runs through the contemplative traditions, which understood the self as continuously formed by experience and action rather than as a fixed thing that simply persists unchanged. That the contemplative traditions understood the self as continuously shaped by the impressions left by experience, and that the contemporary science has established that the connections among the neurons are continuously modified by experience, is a striking relationship. Even as the traditions understood the shaping in the terms of the impressions left by experience, and the science understands it in the terms of the changing connections among neurons, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. The disturbing depth of the question emerges when we recognize that the pattern is not merely modified slowly across the years, but is, in a sense, reconstructed continuously, even from moment to moment, in the ongoing activity of the brain that produces the experience of being a continuous self. It is one thing to recognize that the pattern of the self changes slowly across the years, the way a person changes as they grow and age, the change being gradual enough that the continuity of the self seems preserved through it. It is another and more disturbing thing to recognize that the self is not a fixed structure that is slowly modified, but a process that is continuously produced. The sense of being a self, being something that the brain generates moment by moment, rather than a fixed thing that simply persists. The contemporary neuroscience has established that the brain does not contain a fixed self that persists unchanged through time, but continuously produces the experience of being a self through ongoing activity, the sense of being a continuous person, being itself something that the brain produces, rather than a fixed thing that simply exists. The self, on this understanding, is less like a statue that endures, and more like a flame or a fountain, a pattern that exists only in the ongoing process that produces it. The sense of being a continuous self, being continuously generated, rather than simply persisting. A fountain holds its shape only as long as the water continues to flow through it, the shape being not a fixed thing but a pattern maintained by the ongoing flow, and the moment the flow stops, the shape is gone. The self, on this understanding, is like the fountain rather than the statue, a pattern maintained by an ongoing process rather than a fixed thing that simply persists. The continuity of the self, depending on the continuation of the process that produces it. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, whose work at the University of Southern California has examined the neural basis of the self, has articulated a framework in which the self is not a fixed thing but a continuously constructed process, the brain continuously producing the sense of being a self through the ongoing integration of the signals from the body and the world. Damasio's research, summarized in his books including The Feeling of What Happens and Self Comes to Mind, has argued that the self is not a thing located somewhere in the brain but a process that the brain continuously generates, the sense of being a self arising from the brain's ongoing mapping of the state of the body and its integration of this mapping with the perception of the world. Damasio articulated this through the distinction among different levels of the self, from the basic sense of being a living body to the autobiographical self that is constituted by the memories and the narrative of the person's life, with all the levels being understood as continuously constructed processes rather than fixed things. The autobiographical self, the self that is constituted by the memories of the person's past and the sense of being a continuous person with a history, is on Damasio's framework not a fixed structure, but a continuously constructed process. The brain continuously generating the sense of being a continuous person through the integration of the memories and the ongoing experience. This autobiographical self is the self that you most identify with, the self that has a name and a history, the self that was that child and that has lived the years between. And it is precisely this self that Damasio's framework identifies as a continuously constructed process rather than a fixed thing. The sense of being a continuous person with a history being continuously generated by the brain rather than simply existing as a fixed foundation. The recognition bears directly on the question of what you are, since if the self is a continuously constructed process rather than a fixed thing, then the continuity of the self is itself something that is continuously produced rather than a solid foundation that simply persists. The sense of being the same person who was that child being itself a construction that the brain produces in the present. The contemplative traditions arrived at their own recognition that the self is continuously arising rather than fixed, that the sense of being a permanent self conceals a continuous process of arising and passing. The recognition that the contemplative traditions developed through the close examination of the self in contemplative practice The relationship between the contemporary scientific understanding of the self as a continuously constructed process and the contemplative understanding of the self as continuously arising, rather than fixed, is striking. Even as the contemporary science articulates the construction in the terms of the ongoing activity of the brain, while the contemplative traditions articulate the arising in the terms of the impermanence of the self, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that the self is continuously arising rather than fixed, that the sense of being a permanent and continuous self conceals a continuous process of arising and passing, runs through the contemplative traditions, which found in the close examination of the self not a fixed and permanent core, but a continuous process that produces the appearance of a fixed self. That the contemplative traditions recognize the self as continuously arising rather than fixed, and that the contemporary science has established that the self is a continuously constructed process produced by the ongoing activity of the brain, is a striking relationship, even as the traditions understood the arising in the terms of the impermanence of the self, and the science understands the construction in the terms of the activity of the brain, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. The pattern that is you, then, is doubly in flux, the matter that carries it being continuously replaced, and the pattern itself being continuously modified and reconstructed, so that the apparent stability of the self conceals a continuous process of change at every level. The matter is replaced, as the previous stage established, the atoms and molecules and cells continuously exchanged, so that the body is, at the level of its material substance, a different body than it was. And the pattern is modified, as this stage is established, the connections among the neurons continuously reshaped by experience, the self continuously constructed by the ongoing activity of the brain, so that the pattern that organizes the matter is itself in continuous change. There is no fixed point in all this flux, no still center that remains unchanged, while everything else changes, the matter and the pattern alike being in continuous flux, the self being a process at every level, rather than a fixed thing. You might hope to find, somewhere in the flux, a fixed point that remains unchanged, a still center that is the real you, the unchanging core around which the changing matter and the changing pattern revolve. But the contemporary science finds no such fixed point, no unchanging core, the self being in flux at every level that the science can examine, the matter replaced, and the pattern modified, and the felt continuity itself continuously produced, with no still center that remains exempt from the change. And yet, through all this flux, the sense of being a continuous self persists, the felt sense of being the same person who woke up this morning and who was that child years ago, the continuity that seems so solid and so obvious, even as the matter and the pattern that constitute you are in continuous change. The contemporary science suggests that this felt continuity is itself produced by the brain, that the sense of being a continuous self is one of the things that the brain continuously constructs, the brain weaving the moments of experience into the felt sense of a continuous person, even as the underlying matter and pattern are in flux. The recognition is disturbing because it suggests that the continuity of the self, which seems the most solid and certain thing in your experience, is itself a construction, a story that the brain tells, a letter continuously rewritten, in which the sense of being the same letter is itself part of what is written. You feel yourself to be a continuous person, the same person who was that child and who woke up this morning and who is reading these words, and this felt continuity seems the most certain thing in your experience, more certain than anything in the external world, the very foundation on which your sense of reality rests. And yet the contemporary science suggests that this felt continuity is itself produced, that the sense of being a continuous self is one of the things that the brain constructs, woven from the threads of memory and the ongoing experience into the felt sense of a continuous person, the continuity being part of what is constructed rather than a foundation that exists prior to the construction. The letter is rewritten, and part of what is written into each copy is the sense that it is the same letter, so that the very continuity of the letter is part of what is continuously rewritten. The contemplative traditions arrived at their own recognition that the felt continuity of the self is a kind of construction, that the sense of being a permanent and continuous self is produced rather than given, that the close examination of the self reveals not a fixed core, but a continuous process that produces the appearance of a fixed self. The relationship between the contemporary scientific understanding of the felt continuity of the self as a construction and the contemplative understanding of the continuous self as an appearance produced rather than given is striking. Even as the contemporary science articulates the construction in the terms of the activity of the brain, while the contemplative traditions articulate the appearance in the terms of the constructed nature of the self, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that the felt continuity of the self is produced rather than given, that the sense of being a permanent and continuous self is a construction rather than a foundation, runs through the contemplative traditions, which found in the close examination of the self not a fixed and permanent core, but a continuous process that produces the appearance of a fixed self, the appearance being produced by the very process that the examination reveals. That the contemplative traditions recognize the felt continuity of the self as an appearance produced rather than given, and that the contemporary science has established that the felt continuity of the self is continuously constructed by the brain, is a striking relationship. Even as the traditions understood the appearance in the terms of the constructed nature of the self, and the science understands the construction in the terms of the activity of the brain, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. The investigation will continue in the subsequent stages, with the deeper examination of the construction of the self, the recognition that the continuity of the self is something the brain continuously produces, and the frameworks that the great contemplative traditions of the West and the East have developed for understanding what persists, if anything persists, through the continuous flux of the matter and the pattern. The next stage will examine more closely the story that the brain tells, the recognition that the continuity of the self is a narrative that the brain continuously constructs, and the disturbing question of whether the self that you take yourself to be is a fixed reality or a story that is continuously told. The next stage will examine in particular the recognition that the self is, in substantial part, a narrative, a story that the brain continuously tells about who you are, weaving the memories and the experiences into a coherent account of a continuous person, and the disturbing question of what happens to the self if the narrative is recognized as a construction rather than a record, if the story that the brain tells is recognized as a story rather than the simple truth about a fixed self. The subsequent stages will examine the frameworks that the great contemplative traditions of the West and the East have developed for understanding what persists through the flux. The Christian and Greek and Jewish frameworks of the soul, the Hindu and Buddhist and Taoist frameworks of the self and the non-self, and the synthesis of all that the investigation has explored. The recognition that the pattern that constitutes you is not a fixed thing, but is continuously maintained and modified and reconstructed, that you are doubly in flux at the level of the matter and at the level of the pattern, and that the felt continuity of the self is itself something that the brain continuously produces, is the recognition that this stage has explored. You are a letter being rewritten, word by word, not only in the material on which it is written, but in the very words themselves, and the question of whether anything of the original letter survives, of what you are beneath the continuous rewriting, is the question that the investigation will continue to examine. The previous stage established that the material on which the letter is written is continuously replaced, the paper and the ink continuously renewed. This stage has established that the words themselves are continuously rewritten, the pattern that the letter expresses continuously modified, so that the letter is rewritten at every level, in its material and in its words, and the sense that it is the same letter is itself part of what is continuously written. What survives this continuous rewriting, if anything survives, what you are beneath the flux of the matter and the pattern alike, is the question that the investigation will continue to examine through the frameworks that the great contemplative traditions have developed for understanding what persists through the flux. The investigation continues. The self you take yourself to be is a story, and the storyteller is the same brain that tells it. This is the most disturbing recognition that this investigation has yet reached. More disturbing than the replacement of the matter, and more disturbing than the modification of the pattern, because it strikes at the very thing that seemed to survive those earlier disturbances, the felt sense of being a continuous self. You feel yourself to be a real and continuous person, and you take this felt sense to be your most direct knowledge of what you are, more certain than anything else you know. And yet this felt sense, the recognition of this stage suggests, is itself produced, a story that the brain tells, so that the most certain thing in your experience turns out to be a construction. When the matter of the body was found to be continuously replaced, the self seemed to survive in the pattern. When the pattern was found to be continuously modified, the self seemed to survive in the felt continuity that persisted through the changes of the pattern. But now this felt continuity itself, the last refuge of the self, is found to be a construction, a story that the brain tells, so that there is no refuge left, no fixed self that survives all the disturbances, only the continuous telling of a story whose protagonist is the self. The previous stages established that the matter of the body is continuously replaced, and that the pattern that organizes the matter is continuously modified. But through all of that, the sense of being a continuous self seemed to persist. The felt continuity that connects you to the child you were and to the person who woke up this morning. This stage will examine the recognition that this felt continuity is itself a construction, a story that the brain continuously tells, a narrative that weaves the moments of experience into the appearance of a single continuous person, and that the self you take yourself to be is, in substantial part, the protagonist of this story rather than a fixed reality that exists prior to it. The letter that is continuously rewritten contains, written into it, the claim that it is the same letter, the sense of continuity, being part of what is written, rather than a fact about the letter that exists independently of the writing. This is the deepest turn of the metaphor that has guided this investigation. The letter is rewritten, word by word, in its material and in its words alike, as the previous stages established. But now we recognize that among the words that are written into each copy is the claim that this is the same letter that it always was, the assertion of continuity being itself one of the things that is written, so that the letter does not merely happen to be continuous, but writes its own continuity into itself, asserting in each copy that it is the same letter, the continuity being a claim that the letter makes about itself, rather than a fact that exists independently of the letter's assertion of it. So too, with the self. The narrative of the self does not merely happen to be continuous, but writes its own continuity into itself, the sense of being the same person who was that child, being one of the things that the narrative asserts, the continuity being a claim that the self makes about itself, rather than a fact that exists independently of the claim. The contemporary neuroscience and psychology have established that the brain continuously constructs the narrative of the self, that the sense of being a continuous person with a history is something the brain produces rather than a fixed reality it discovers, and the findings bear directly on the question of what you are and of whether the self you take yourself to be is a reality or a story. The contemplative traditions arrived at their own recognition that the self is, in a sense, a construction, that the sense of being a fixed and continuous self is produced rather than given, that the close examination of the self reveals not a fixed entity, but a process that produces the appearance of one, the recognition that the contemplative traditions developed through the close examination of the self in contemplative practice. The relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition that the self is a narrative the brain constructs and the contemplative recognition that the self is a construction rather than a fixed reality is striking. Even as the contemporary science articulates the construction in the terms of the narrative activity of the brain, while the contemplative traditions articulate it in the terms of the constructed nature of the self, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that the self is in some sense constructed, that the sense of being a fixed and continuous self is produced rather than simply given, runs through the contemplative traditions, which found in the close examination of the self, not a fixed entity, but a process that produces the appearance of one, that the contemplative traditions recognized the self as a construction rather than a fixed reality, and that the contemporary science has established that the self is a narrative the brain continuously constructs, is a striking relationship. Even as the traditions understood the construction in the terms of the constructed nature of the self, and the science understands it in the terms of the narrative activity of the brain, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. The recognition that the self is, in substantial part, a narrative was articulated influentially by the philosopher Dennett, whose work at Tufts University examined the nature of the self and consciousness across several decades. Dennett articulated the framework that the self is what he called a center of narrative gravity, an abstraction that the brain produces by weaving the events of experience into a coherent story, the self being the central character of this story rather than a concrete thing located somewhere in the brain. Dennett argued that just as a center of gravity is not a physical object, but a useful abstraction that characterizes the behavior of a physical system, a point at which the mass of an object can be treated as concentrated, even though there is no physical thing located at that point. The self is not a physical thing located in the brain, but an abstraction that the brain produces by organizing experience into a narrative. The self being real as an abstraction, while not being the concrete entity that ordinary thinking takes it to be. The framework held that the brain, faced with the constant stream of experience, organizes that experience into a coherent narrative, a story with a central character who is the protagonist of the experiences, and that this central character, the self, is the center of narrative gravity around which the story is organized, an abstraction that is useful and even indispensable, but that is not the concrete thing that ordinary thinking takes the self to be. The framework, articulated in his 1991 book Consciousness Explained, and in subsequent work, was disturbing in its implications, since it suggested that the self that you take to be the most real thing in your experience is not a concrete reality, but a useful fiction, a story that the brain tells, a center of narrative gravity that organizes the experience without being a concrete thing. Dennett did not mean by this that the self is unreal in every sense, since a center of gravity is real in the sense that it characterizes the behavior of a physical system, and the self is real in the sense that it is an indispensable abstraction that organizes the experience. But the self is not real in the sense that ordinary thinking takes it to be, not a concrete thing located somewhere in the brain, not a fixed entity that exists independently of the narrative, but an abstraction that the brain produces, real as an abstraction while not being the concrete reality that you take yourself to be. The contemplative traditions arrived at their own recognition that the self is not the concrete reality that ordinary thinking takes it to be, that the sense of being a fixed and concrete self is a kind of construction or appearance rather than a fixed reality. the recognition that the contemplative traditions developed through the close examination of the self, the relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition of the self as a center of narrative gravity and the contemplative recognition of the self as a construction rather than a concrete reality is striking, even as the contemporary science articulates the self in the terms of the narrative abstraction, while the contemplative traditions articulate it in the terms of the constructed appearance of the self, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that the self is not the concrete and independent reality that ordinary thinking takes it to be, that the sense of being a fixed and concrete self is a construction or an appearance, runs through the contemplative traditions, which found in the close examination of the self not the concrete entity that ordinary thinking expects, but a process that produces the appearance of one. That the contemplative traditions recognize the self as a construction rather than a concrete reality, and that the contemporary science has articulated the self as a center of narrative gravity rather than a concrete thing, is a striking relationship, even as the traditions understood the self in the terms of the constructed appearance, and the science understands it in the terms of the narrative abstraction, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. The narrative that constitutes the self is woven, in substantial part, from memory, and the contemporary science of memory has established that memory is not the reliable record of the past that it seems to be, but a continuous reconstruction that is shaped by the present. The story of who you are is, more than anything else, a story about your past, the account of where you came from, and what has happened to you, and what you have done, the memories that constitute your sense of having a history and being a continuous person with that history. If the narrative of the self is the story of your past, then the reliability of the narrative depends on the reliability of the memories from which it is woven, and the contemporary science has established that these memories are far less reliable than they seem, that they are not fixed records of what happened but continuous reconstructions that are shaped by the present circumstances of the remembering. The story of who you are rests on the memories of who you have been, and if those memories are not reliable records but continuous reconstructions, then the story of who you are rests on a foundation that is itself continuously shifting. The narrative of the self being woven from materials that are themselves being continuously remade, so that the disturbance reaches all the way down, the narrative being a construction woven from materials that are themselves constructions. The psychologist Elizabeth Loftus, whose research at the University of California, Irvine, has examined the malleability of memory across decades, established that memories can be substantially modified through suggestion, that people can come to remember events that never occurred, and that the memories that constitute the felt sense of personal history are far less reliable than they seem. Loftus's research, including the famous studies in which subjects came to remember being lost in a shopping mall as children when family members provided fabricated accounts of such incidents, established that the memories that constitute the narrative of the self are not stable records but continuous reconstructions, shaped by suggestion and by the present circumstances of the remembering. The studies demonstrated that a substantial proportion of subjects could be led to remember entire events that had never occurred, complete with vivid details that the subjects themselves supplied, the false memories being indistinguishable to the subjects from genuine memories of events that had actually happened. The recognition that the very vividness and confidence of a memory is no guarantee of its accuracy. The subjects who came to remember being lost in a shopping mall, an event that had never happened to them, did not merely report the event flatly but elaborated it with details, describing the fear they had felt and the person who had found them, and the relief of being reunited with their family, the false memory being filled in with the texture of a genuine memory, so that the subjects could not tell, from the inside, that the memory was false. This is the disturbing core of Loftus's finding, that a false memory can feel exactly like a true one, that the felt quality of a memory is no guide to whether it records something that actually happened, so that you cannot tell, from the inside, which of your memories are accurate records and which are reconstructions that have drifted from, or even wholly departed from what actually occurred. Loftus's earlier research had established that even the wording of a question could modify a memory, that subjects who were asked how fast cars were going when they smashed into each other reported higher speeds than subjects who were asked how fast the cars were going when they hit each other. The memory being shaped by the suggestion contained in the question, the recognition that memory is not a fixed record, but a reconstruction that is continuously shaped by the circumstances of the remembering. The recognition bears directly on the question of what you are, since if the narrative of the self is woven from memories that are themselves continuous reconstructions rather than reliable records, then the narrative is a construction at every level, the very materials from which the story of the self is woven being themselves continuously reconstructed rather than fixed records of what actually happened. The contemplative traditions arrived at their own recognition that the memories that constitute the sense of the self are not reliable records but are shaped by the mind, that the attachment to the remembered past is a kind of construction that the mind produces, the recognition that the contemplative traditions developed through the examination of the relationship between memory and the self. The traditions recognize that the person clings to a remembered past, building from it a sense of who they are, and that this remembered past is shaped by the mind's attachments and aversions rather than being a neutral record, the mind constructing from the materials of memory an account of the self that serves the mind's attachment to being a continuous and substantial self. The relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition that memory is a continuous reconstruction and the contemplative recognition that the remembered past is shaped by the mind is striking. Even as the contemporary science articulates the reconstruction in the terms of the malleability of memory, while the contemplative traditions articulate it in the terms of the mind's shaping of the remembered past, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that the remembered past is not a fixed record, but is shaped and reshaped by the mind, that the attachment to the remembered past is a kind of construction, runs through the contemplative traditions, which examine the relationship between memory and the self, and found the remembered past to be shaped by the mind rather than a fixed record of what occurred. That the contemplative traditions recognize the remembered past as shaped by the mind, and that the contemporary science has established that memory is a continuous reconstruction subject to modification, is a striking relationship, even as the traditions understood the shaping in the terms of the mind's construction of the remembered past, and the science understands it in the terms of the malleability of memory, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. The disturbing depth of the recognition emerges when we consider that the narrative of the self is not assembled from reliable materials and then maintained, but is continuously reconstructed, so that the self that the narrative constitutes is continuously remade rather than simply persisting. It would be one thing if the narrative of the self were assembled once from reliable memories and then maintained unchanged, the story being told once and then preserved. But the contemporary science has established that this is not how memory works, that the memories from which the narrative is woven are not fixed records that are preserved unchanged but are continuously reconstructed, remade each time they are recalled, so that the narrative of the self is not told once and preserved, but is continuously retold, and in the retelling, continuously remade. The contemporary science of memory has established that memories are not retrieved intact from storage but are reconstructed each time they are recalled, and that the reconstruction can modify the memory so that the act of remembering changes the memory that is remembered. The neuroscientist Karim Nader, whose research at McGill University transformed the understanding of memory, established that memories become labile each time they are retrieved, entering a state in which they can be modified before being stored again, the process called reconsolidation. Nader's research, published in a foundational paper in the journal Nature in 2000, established that a memory is not a fixed record that is retrieved unchanged, but is reconstructed each time it is recalled, with the reconstruction being subject to modification, so that the memory that you recall is shaped by every previous recollection and by the present circumstances of the recalling. Nader's experiments demonstrated that a memory that had been stable for a long time could be eliminated by interfering with the reconsolidation process during its retrieval, establishing that the memory is not simply read out from storage when it is recalled, but is actively reconstructed, the reconstruction requiring the same molecular processes that formed the memory in the first place, so that each recollection is, in a sense, a reformation of the memory rather than a mere reading of it. The finding overturned the long-standing assumption that a memory, once consolidated, was a fixed record that could be read out without being changed, establishing instead that the very act of recalling a memory returns it to a labile state in which it must be reconsolidated and in which it can be modified, so that remembering is not a passive reading of a fixed record, but an active reconstruction that can change what is remembered. The implication, when followed through, is startling, since it means that the memories you recall most often, the memories that are most central to your sense of who you are precisely the memories that have been most often reconstructed, most often modified, most distant from whatever original encoding they began as. The memories that constitute the core of the narrative of the self being the memories that have been most thoroughly remade through repeated recollection. The memory you treasure most, the memory you return to again and again as central to who you are, is not preserved by your frequent returning to it, but is, on the contrary, the most reworked of all your memories, each recollection having reconstructed it and potentially modified it, so that the cherished memory at the core of your sense of self may be the furthest of all your memories, from what actually happened, remade by the very frequency of your returning to it. The memories you have recalled only rarely, by contrast, may be closer to their original encoding, having been subject to fewer reconstructions, so that the reliability of a memory may be inversely related to its centrality to your sense of who you are, the most central memories being the most reworked. The recognition bears directly on the question of what you are, since, if the memories that constitute the narrative of the self are continuously reconstructed and modified each time they are recalled, then the narrative of the self is not a fixed story that is told and retold unchanged, but a continuously reconstructed story, the self that the narrative constitutes, being continuously remade rather than simply persisting. The contemplative traditions arrived at their own recognition that the self is continuously remade rather than fixed, that the sense of being a continuous self conceals a continuous process of construction and reconstruction, the recognition that the contemplative traditions developed through the close examination of the self. The relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition that memory is continuously reconstructed and the contemplative recognition that the self is continuously remade is striking. Even as the contemporary science articulates the reconstruction in the terms of the reconsolidation of memory, while the contemplative traditions articulate it in the terms of the continuous construction of the self, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that the self is continuously remade rather than fixed, that the sense of being a continuous self conceals a continuous process of construction and reconstruction, runs through the contemplative traditions, which found in the close examination of the self not a fixed entity that simply persists, but a continuous process of arising and construction, that the contemplative traditions recognize the self as continuously remade rather than fixed, and that the contemporary science has established that the memories from which the self is woven are continuously reconstructed through reconsolidation, is a striking relationship. Even as the traditions understood the remaking in the terms of the continuous construction of the self, and the science understands it in the terms of the reconsolidation of memory, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. If the self is a narrative continuously reconstructed from memories that are themselves continuously reconstructed, then the question of what you are becomes genuinely vertiginous, since there seems to be no fixed reality beneath the construction, no concrete self that the story is about, only the continuous telling of the story itself. We are accustomed to thinking that a story is a story about something, that the narrative of the self is a story about a real self that exists independently of the story, the way a biography is a story about a real person who lived. But the recognition that this stage has reached is that there is no such independent self beneath the narrative of the self, no concrete person that the story is about and that exists independently of the telling, only the continuous telling itself, the narrative that produces the appearance of a self without there being a fixed self that the narrative is about. And yet the story is told, the narrative is woven, the sense of being a continuous self is produced, and the question arises of what produces it, of who or what tells the story, if there is no fixed self that is its author. The contemporary science suggests that the story is told by the brain, that the narrative of the self is produced by the very brain whose activity the narrative is about, so that the storyteller and the story are not separate, the brain both producing the narrative and being characterized by it, the self being a story that the brain tells about itself. There is a strange circularity here, since we ordinarily imagine that a story has an author who is distinct from the story, a teller who exists independently of the tale. But in the case of the self, the contemporary science suggests there is no such independent author, the story being told by the brain whose activity the story is about, the teller and the told being the same process, the brain producing a narrative whose central character is the very self that the narrative produces, so that there is no author standing outside the story, only the continuous self-production of the narrative. The recognition is vertiginous because it offers no fixed point, no author standing outside the story who tells it, only the continuous activity of the brain producing the narrative of a self that is nothing other than the protagonist of the narrative that the brain produces. The contemplative traditions arrived at their own recognition that the self is, in this sense, empty of a fixed and independent reality, that the close examination of the self reveals not a fixed author or a concrete entity, but a process that produces the appearance of one. The recognition that the contemplative traditions developed through the close examination of the self in contemplative practice. The relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition that the self is a story the brain tells about itself, with no fixed author standing outside the story, and the contemplative recognition that the self is empty of a fixed and independent reality is striking, even as the contemporary science articulates the recognition in the terms of the brain producing the narrative, while the contemplative traditions articulate it in the terms of the emptiness of the self, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. It should be said, before the investigation proceeds, that the recognition that the self is, in this sense, a construction, is not, in the contemplative traditions that arrived at it, a cause for despair, but is, in those traditions, a recognition that can be liberating, the recognition that the self one had taken to be a fixed and separate thing, to be defended and clung to, is more open and more fluid than it had seemed, the recognition opening onto a different, and in the traditions, a freer way of being rather than onto a void. The contemplative traditions that recognized the constructed nature of the self did not find in this recognition a reason for anguish, but a doorway to a deeper understanding, and the disturbance that the contemporary findings produce, when it is followed all the way through, may open onto a similar recognition rather than onto mere loss, a point that the subsequent stages will develop through the examination of the traditions. The recognition that the self is empty of a fixed and independent reality runs through the contemplative traditions, which found in the close examination of the self not a fixed author or a concrete entity, but a process that produces the appearance of one, and which understood this recognition not as a cause for despair, but as a doorway to a deeper and freer way of being. The investigation will continue in the subsequent stages, with the frameworks that the great contemplative traditions of the West and the East have developed for understanding what persists, if anything persists, through the continuous construction of the self and the synthesis of all that the investigation has explored. The next stage will examine the frameworks that the great contemplative traditions of the West have developed for understanding the self that persists through the changes of the body and the construction of the narrative. The Christian and Greek and Jewish frameworks of the soul, the frameworks that located what is essential about the person in a principle that persists through the changes. The next stage will examine in particular how the Western traditions, confronting the same changing and constructed self, located what is essential about the person, not in the changing body, nor in the constructed narrative, but in the soul, the principle that they held to persist through the changes of the body and to constitute what is most essential about the person, the frameworks of the soul that the Greek and Christian and Jewish traditions developed across the centuries. The subsequent stages will examine the frameworks that the great contemplative traditions of the East have developed, the Hindu framework of the deeper self, and the Buddhist framework of the non-self, and the Taoist framework of the self as a transformation and the synthesis of all that the investigation has explored. The recognition that the self you take yourself to be is, in substantial part, a narrative that the brain continuously constructs, woven from memories that are themselves continuously reconstructed, with no fixed reality beneath the construction that the science can find, is the recognition that this stage has explored. You are a letter being rewritten, and written into the letter is the claim that it is the same letter that it always was, the continuity being part of the story rather than a fact that exists independently of the telling, and the question of what you are beneath the story, of whether there is anything beneath the story at all, is the question that the investigation will continue to examine. The previous stages establish that the material of the letter is replaced and that the words of the letter are rewritten. This stage has established that among the words written into the letter is the assertion that it is the same letter, the continuity being part of what is written rather than a fact about the letter, so that the letter asserts its own continuity in the very act of being rewritten. Whether there is, beneath all this writing and rewriting, anything that the letter is genuinely about, any fixed reality that the narrative of the self refers to, or whether there is only the continuous writing itself, is the question that the contemporary findings leave open, and that the contemplative traditions have addressed through their frameworks of the soul and the self and the non-self, the frameworks that the subsequent stages of this investigation will examine. The investigation continues. For 2,000 years, the West has insisted that something in you does not change. The contemporary science has established that the matter of your body is continuously replaced, that the pattern that organizes the matter is continuously modified, and that the felt continuity of the self is a narrative that the brain continuously constructs, and these recognitions seem to leave nothing fixed, nothing that endures unchanged through the flux. The previous stages led, step by step, to the recognition that the self is in flux at every level that the science can examine, the matter replaced, the pattern modified, the felt continuity itself constructed, with no still center that the science can find. But the great traditions of the West, confronting the same changing and uncertain self, insisted that something in the person does not change, that beneath the changing body and the changing pattern and the constructed narrative, there is a principle that endures, a principle that they called the soul. The traditions of the West did not arrive at this insistence in ignorance of the changing nature of the body, for they knew well that the body grows and ages and changes and dies, that the person of old age is far removed from the child, that the body is a thing in constant transformation. They insisted, in full awareness of the changing body, that what is essential about the person is not the changing body but a principle that endures through the changes, the soul, and they developed across 2,000 years sophisticated frameworks for articulating what this enduring principle is and how it relates to the changing body. The Western traditions did not deny that the body changes, that the person grows and ages and is transformed across the years. They located what is essential about the person, not in the changing body, but in the soul. The principle that they held to persist unchanged through the changes of the body, the principle that constitutes what is most essential and most enduring about the person. This stage will examine the frameworks that the great traditions of the West developed for understanding the soul, the Greek philosophical framework of the psyche, the Christian theological framework of the immortal soul, and the Jewish framework of the vital and spiritual principle, the frameworks that located what is essential about the person in a principle that persists through the changes that the contemporary science has established. The contemporary science establishes the changes, the replacement of the matter, and the modification of the pattern and the construction of the narrative, and it locates no fixed principle that endures unchanged through the changes, finding the self to be in flux at every level that it can examine. The Western traditions located what is essential about the person in the soul, the principle that they held to persist through the changes, and the relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition of the changing self and the traditional recognition of the enduring soul is striking. Even as the contemporary science articulates the changes in the terms of the biology and the neuroscience, while the traditions articulate the enduring principle in the terms of the soul, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. There is a genuine tension here that the investigation must not obscure, since the contemporary science finds the self to be in flux at every level, while the traditions insist on a principle that endures unchanged through the flux, and these are not obviously the same recognition articulated in different terms, but may be genuinely different claims about what the person is. The traditions held that beneath the changing body there is an enduring soul, while the contemporary science finds, beneath the changing body, only a changing pattern and a constructed narrative, with no enduring principle that it can identify. Whether the soul that the traditions affirm is something that the contemporary science simply cannot detect, or whether the traditions were mistaken in positing an enduring principle that does not exist, or whether the soul and the changing pattern are somehow the same thing differently understood, is a question that the investigation will examine and that the synthesis will address, without supposing in advance that the traditional and the scientific recognitions must agree. The Greek philosophical tradition provided the conceptual foundations for the Western understanding of the soul, and it articulated the soul as the principle that animates the living being and that, in its highest form, persists beyond the changes of the body. The Greek word for the soul, psyche, originally referred to the breath that distinguishes the living from the dead, and it came to refer to the principle that animates the living being, the principle whose presence makes the body alive and whose departure leaves the body a corpse. The philosopher Plato, writing in the 4th century before the Common Era, articulated the most influential of the early frameworks for the immortality of the soul, presenting in the dialogue, the Phaedo, a series of arguments for the conclusion that the soul persists beyond the dissolution of the body. The Phaedo presents the final hours of Socrates before his execution, with Socrates conversing with his disciples about the fate of the soul after death, his composure in the face of death being presented as the practical demonstration of the philosophical conclusions that the dialogue articulates. The setting is among the most dramatically powerful in the history of philosophy. Socrates discussing the immortality of the soul calmly on the very day of his execution, his serenity in the face of death offered as the evidence that the philosopher, who has spent his life preparing for the separation of the soul from the body, need not fear the death that accomplishes that separation. Plato argued, through the figure of Socrates, that the philosophical life is itself a preparation for death understood as the separation of the soul from the body. The philosopher, seeking throughout life to free the soul from the distractions of the body and to attain the pure knowledge of the eternal truths that the body's appetites and distractions impede. Plato argued that the soul is akin to the eternal and unchanging forms that it is capable of knowing, the perfect and eternal realities such as perfect equality and perfect beauty that the soul apprehends through reason rather than through the senses, and that the soul, being akin to these eternal and unchanging realities, must itself be of an eternal and unchanging nature, rather than subject to the dissolution that claims the changing things of the material world. The argument, which has been called the affinity argument, holds that the soul, being capable of knowing the eternal and unchanging forms, must be akin to them in its nature, and that it must therefore share their eternal and unchanging character, rather than the changing and dissolving character of the material things of the sensible world. The framework located what is essential about the person in the soul, the principle that is akin to the eternal forms and that persists unchanged through the changes of the body. The contemporary science has established that what is essential about the person is not the changing matter, but the pattern, the organizing principle that is of a different nature than the specific material components, even as the contemporary science finds that the pattern itself is in flux rather than eternal and unchanging. The relationship between the Platonic framework of the soul as akin to the eternal and unchanging forms and the contemporary scientific recognition of the pattern as the organizing principle distinct from the material substrate is striking, even as the Platonic framework articulates the soul as eternal and unchanging, while the contemporary science finds the pattern itself to be in flux, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science or the philosophy themselves establish. The difference is significant and must not be obscured, since the Platonic framework held the soul to be eternal and unchanging, akin to the changeless forms, while the contemporary science finds that the pattern that organizes the person is not changeless, but is itself in continuous flux, modified by experience and reconstructed from moment to moment. The Platonic soul endures because it is changeless, akin to the eternal forms, while the contemporary pattern, far from being changeless, is among the most changeable things that the science examines, so that the Platonic framework and the contemporary science, while both locating what is essential about the person in something other than the changing matter, differ profoundly in whether that something is changeless or itself in flux. That both the Platonic framework and the contemporary science locate what is essential about the person in something other than the changing matter, the Platonic framework in the eternal soul and the contemporary science in the pattern, is a striking relationship, even as they differ profoundly in whether the essential principle is changeless or in flux, and the relationship between them remains a matter for reflection. The philosopher Aristotle, writing in the 4th century before the Common Era, developed the framework differently, articulating the soul not as a separate substance temporarily incarnated in the body, but as the form of the living body, the principle of organization that makes the matter of the body into a living being of a specific kind. Aristotle articulated the soul in his treatise on the soul, known by its Latin title De Anima, as the first actuality of a natural body that has life potentially within it, the principle that actualizes the potential for life that the organized body possesses. The framework treated the soul as the form of the body rather than as a separate substance, with the form being the principle of organization that makes the matter into a living being, the soul being to the body as the shape is to the bronze of a statue, not a separate thing but the organizing principle that makes the matter into what it is. On this framework, the soul is not a ghostly substance that inhabits the body and could float free of it, but the very organization of the living body, the principle that makes the matter alive and makes it the specific kind of living thing that it is, the soul being inseparable from the body in the way that the shape of a statue is inseparable from the bronze, not a separate thing but the form that the matter takes. The Aristotelian framework bears a striking resemblance to the contemporary scientific recognition that what is essential about the living being is the pattern, the principle of organization, rather than the specific matter, with the soul as the form of the body corresponding in a certain structural sense to the pattern that organizes the matter. The framework nonetheless preserved a distinctive role for the rational aspect of the soul, the intellect, which Aristotle suggested might be capable of existing independently of the body in a manner that the other aspects of the soul could not, the rational soul being capable of operations that exceed what any merely material structure can perform. Aristotle suggested, in the difficult and much debated passages of the third book of his treatise on the soul, that the active intellect might be separable from the body, immortal, and eternal in a manner that the other aspects of the soul are not, the precise meaning of these passages having been debated across the subsequent history of philosophy. The contemporary science has established that what is essential about the living being is the pattern, the organizing principle, rather than the specific matter, even as the contemporary science treats the pattern as a feature of the organization of the material system, rather than as a form capable of existing independently of the matter. The relationship between the Aristotelian framework of the soul as the form of the body and the contemporary scientific recognition of the pattern as the organizing principle is striking, even as the Aristotelian framework treats the rational soul as capable of independent existence, while the contemporary science treats the pattern as a feature of the material system, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science or the philosophy themselves establish. The Aristotelian framework of the soul as the form of the body is, of all the traditional frameworks, perhaps the closest in its structure to the contemporary scientific recognition of the pattern as the organizing principle, since both treat what is essential about the living being as the organization of the matter rather than as a separate substance, the soul as the form of the body, corresponding closely to the pattern that organizes the matter. The closeness of this correspondence is striking, the Aristotelian form and the contemporary pattern both being the principle of organization that makes the matter into a living being of a specific kind, neither being a separate substance that inhabits the matter, both being the organization of the matter itself, that the Aristotelian framework located what is essential about the living being in the form, the organizing principle, and that the contemporary science has located what is essential in the pattern, the organizing principle, is a striking relationship, even as the Aristotelian framework preserved a distinctive role for the rational soul as capable of independent existence, while the contemporary science treats the pattern as a feature of the material system, and the relationship between them remains a matter for reflection. The Christian theological tradition developed the framework of the immortal soul across 2,000 years of theological reflection, integrating the Greek philosophical resources with the distinctive Christian commitments. The framework was developed initially through the engagement of the early Christian theologians with the Greek philosophical tradition, and it was elaborated across the centuries by theologians including Augustine in the 5th century, who articulated the soul as an immaterial substance drawing on the Platonic tradition, and Aquinas in the 13th century, who articulated the soul as the form of the body drawing on the Aristotelian tradition. The framework was developed most fully by the theologian Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, who integrated the Aristotelian understanding of the soul as the form of the body with the Christian commitment to the soul's persistence beyond death. Aquinas faced a substantial challenge in this integration, since the Aristotelian framework had treated most aspects of the soul as inseparable from the body, the soul being the form of the body rather than a separate substance, and the challenge was to articulate how the soul, understood as the form of the body, could nonetheless persist beyond the dissolution of the body. Aquinas resolved the challenge by articulating the rational soul as a distinctive kind of form, one that organizes the matter of the body but that, unlike the forms of plants and non-rational animals, possesses operations that do not depend on any bodily organ, the operations of the intellect that are capable of knowing the universal and eternal truths. Aquinas argued, in the Summa Theologiae composed across the 1260s and 1270s, that the rational soul is incorruptible because of its immateriality, that a faculty capable of knowing the universal natures of all material things cannot itself be a particular material thing, and that the rational soul, being immaterial, is therefore not subject to the corruption that claims material things. The argument proceeds through the observation that the rational soul is capable of knowing the natures of all material things, that the intellect can grasp the universal nature of any kind of material thing whatsoever, and that a faculty capable of knowing all material natures cannot itself be a particular material thing. Since a particular material thing would be limited by its own specific nature in a way that would prevent it from knowing all natures, the way the eye, being itself coloured, would be unable to see if it were not free of any particular colour. The rational soul, being capable of knowing all material natures, must therefore be immaterial, and being immaterial, it is not subject to the corruption that claims material things, which corrupt through the dissolution of their material components, the immaterial soul having no material components to dissolve. The framework located what is essential about the person in the rational soul, the immaterial principle that organizes the body, but that is capable of subsisting independently of the body, the principle that persists beyond the dissolution of the body. The framework was developed across centuries of subsequent Catholic theological reflection and remains the dominant Catholic understanding of the soul's nature and persistence, the incorruptibility of the soul being affirmed as one of the central commitments of the broader tradition. The contemporary science has established that what is essential about the person is the pattern rather than the matter, that the pattern is of a different nature than the specific material components, even as the contemporary science treats the pattern as a feature of the material system, rather than as an immaterial principle capable of independent existence. The relationship between the Thomistic framework of the rational soul as immaterial and incorruptible and the contemporary scientific recognition of the pattern as distinct from the material substrate is striking, even as the Thomistic framework treats the soul as an immaterial subsistent principle, while the contemporary science treats the pattern as a feature of the material system, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The difference is significant, since the Thomistic framework holds the rational soul to be immaterial and capable of subsisting independently of the body, while the contemporary science treats the pattern as a feature of the organization of the material system, not as an immaterial principle that could subsist independently of the matter that it organizes. The Thomistic soul is incorruptible because it is immaterial, having no material components to dissolve, while the contemporary pattern, far from being immaterial, is a feature of the arrangement of the material components, and would not obviously survive the dissolution of the material system whose arrangement it is. That both the Thomistic framework and the contemporary science locate what is essential about the person in something distinct from the specific matter, the Thomistic framework in the immaterial soul and the contemporary science in the pattern, is a striking relationship, even as they differ profoundly in whether the essential principle is an immaterial substance capable of independent existence or a feature of the material system, and the relationship between them remains a matter for reflection. The Christian framework integrated the immortality of the soul with a distinctive Christian commitment to the resurrection of the body, articulating a framework in which what persists is not merely a disembodied soul, but ultimately the complete human person, the union of soul and body restored at the resurrection. The framework holds that the soul, which persists beyond the dissolution of the body, is reunited with the body at the resurrection, with the resurrected body being understood as a transformed and glorified body, rather than simply the restoration of the previous material body. The framework draws on the teaching of Paul in the first letter to the Corinthians, which articulates the resurrection body as a spiritual body distinct from the natural body, sown in corruption and raised in incorruption, sown in dishonor and raised in glory. The framework affirms the goodness of the body and of embodied existence, treating the body as integral to the complete human person, rather than as a prison from which the soul is liberated at death. And it locates the ultimate destiny of the person not in the disembodied existence of the soul, but in the restored union of soul and body at the resurrection. This distinguishes the Christian framework significantly from the Platonic framework, which had tended to treat the body as a prison or a tomb from which the soul is liberated at death, the disembodied existence of the soul being its truest and highest state. The Christian framework, by contrast, affirms the goodness of the body and of embodied existence, treating the disembodied existence of the soul between death and resurrection as an incomplete state that awaits the restoration of the body, the complete human person being the union of soul and body rather than the soul alone. The framework bears in a striking way on the question that this investigation has been examining, the question of what persists through the replacement of the matter. Since the Christian framework holds that what is restored at the resurrection is not the specific matter of the previous body, which has been dispersed, but the person, the pattern reconstituted in a transformed and glorified body, the recognition that what is essential about the person is not the specific matter, but something that can be reconstituted in a transformed body. This recognition that the resurrected body is not the reassembly of the same scattered atoms, but the reconstitution of the person in a transformed body, addresses precisely the puzzle that the replacement of the matter raises, since it locates the identity of the person not in the specific matter, which is dispersed and replaced, but in something that can be reconstituted in different matter, the pattern or the person that the transformed body expresses. The contemporary science has established that what is essential about the person is the pattern, rather than the specific matter, that the specific matter is continuously replaced while the pattern persists. The relationship between the Christian framework of the resurrection as the reconstitution of the person in a transformed body and the contemporary scientific recognition that what is essential is the pattern rather than the specific matter is striking. Even as the Christian framework articulates the reconstitution in the terms of the resurrection by God, while the contemporary science articulates the persistence of the pattern in the terms of the biology, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The Jewish tradition articulated its own distinctive frameworks for understanding the vital and spiritual principle that animates the human being, developing a rich vocabulary for the various aspects of the soul. The Hebrew tradition articulated the human being as animated by the breath of life that God breathes into the material body, with the creation narrative of the book of Genesis describing God forming the first human being from the dust of the ground and breathing into his nostrils the breath of life, the human being thereby becoming a living soul. The image is striking in its bearing on the question of what the person is, since it describes the human being as formed from the dust of the ground, the matter of the earth, and animated by the breath of life that God breathes into it, the living person being the union of the matter of the earth and the divine breath. Neither the matter alone nor the breath alone, but the living whole that results from their union. The framework treats life as something that comes from God rather than as something that emerges from the matter alone. The breath of life being the divine gift that animates the matter and makes it a living being. The human being being animated dust, the matter of the earth, made alive by the breath of God. The Hebrew tradition developed a rich vocabulary for the various aspects of the soul, with the term nephesh referring to the living soul or living being, the term ruach referring to the spirit or breath, and the term neshama referring to the higher soul or the breath of life that God breathes into the human being. The framework, as articulated in the earliest Hebrew texts, emphasized the human being as a unified psychophysical whole rather than as a composite of separable body and soul, with the nephesh being understood as the living being itself rather than as a separable soul that inhabits the body. The recognition that the human being is a unified whole, animated by the divine breath. The early Hebrew tradition did not articulate a clear framework of the immortal soul of the kind that the Greek philosophical tradition developed, with the emphasis being placed instead on the human being as a unified whole, the nephesh being the living being itself rather than a separable soul, the human being being understood as animated dust, the union of the matter of the body and the breath of life that God breathes into it. The framework of personal persistence beyond death developed gradually across the history of the Jewish tradition, with the framework of the resurrection of the dead emerging in the later books of the Hebrew Scriptures, particularly in the book of Daniel, and being developed extensively in the subsequent rabbinic tradition, the resurrection being understood as the restoration of the complete human being at the end of time. The Jewish framework of the resurrection of the dead developed across the history of the tradition, with the framework emerging in the later books of the Hebrew Scriptures and being developed extensively in the subsequent rabbinic tradition, the resurrection being understood as the restoration of the complete human being at the end of time. The contemporary science has established that the human being is a unified whole, that the self is not a separable thing that inhabits the body but is bound up with the living body itself, even as the contemporary science finds the living body to be in continuous flux. The relationship between the Jewish framework of the human being as a unified whole, animated by the divine breath, and the contemporary scientific recognition of the self as bound up with the living body is striking, even as the Jewish framework articulates the unity in the terms of the divine breath, while the contemporary science articulates it in the terms of the biology, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The early Hebrew framework, in treating the human being as a unified psychophysical whole rather than as a separable soul inhabiting a body, stands closer in this respect to the contemporary scientific recognition of the self as bound up with the living body than do the frameworks that treat the soul as a separable substance. Both the Hebrew framework and the contemporary science treating the person as a unified whole rather than as a soul housed in a body. That the early Hebrew framework treated the human being as a unified whole, the living being itself rather than a soul inhabiting a body, and that the contemporary science has found the self to be bound up with the living body rather than a separable thing that inhabits it, is a striking relationship. Even as the Hebrew framework articulates the unity in the terms of the divine breath, and the science articulates it in the terms of the biology, and the relationship between them remains a matter for reflection. The investigation will continue in the subsequent stages with the frameworks that the great contemplative traditions of the East have developed for understanding what persists through the changes of the body and the synthesis of all that the investigation has explored. The next stage will examine the frameworks that the great traditions of the East have developed, the Hindu framework of the eternal self that persists across the dissolution of countless bodies, the Buddhist framework that denies any permanent self while affirming that something continues across the dissolution of the body, and the Taoist framework of the self as a transformation within the broader patterns of the cosmos. The Eastern frameworks will prove to differ profoundly from the Western frameworks examined in this stage and from one another, the Hindu affirmation of the eternal self standing in particular and direct opposition to the Buddhist denial of any permanent self, the differences being genuine and profound rather than superficial differences of emphasis or language. The final stage will bring together all that the investigation has explored, the contemporary science of the changing self and the frameworks of the traditions of the West and the East, into a synthesis that examines what the convergences and the genuine differences might mean for the question of what you are. The recognition that the great traditions of the West located what is essential about the person not in the changing body but in the soul, the principle that they held to persist through the changes, the Greek psyche and the Christian immortal soul and the Jewish vital principle is the recognition that this stage has explored. You are a letter being rewritten, and the traditions of the West held that the meaning of the letter, the essential thing that the letter expresses, persists through the rewriting, the soul being the meaning that endures through the changes of the material and the pattern, and the question of whether the meaning persists, of what you are at the deepest level, is the question that the investigation will continue to examine. The previous stages establish that the material of the letter is replaced, and that the words are rewritten, and that the letter asserts its own continuity. The traditions of the West add to this the claim that there is a meaning that the letter expresses, a meaning that persists through the rewriting of the material and the words, the soul being this enduring meaning rather than the changing material or the changing words. Whether there is such an enduring meaning, a soul that persists through the changes that the science has established, or whether there is only the continuous rewriting with no enduring meaning beneath it, is the question that the Western traditions and the contemporary science answer differently, and that the investigation will continue to examine through the frameworks of the East and the synthesis that follows. The investigation continues. The East divided over the very question of whether there is anything in you that does not change, while the great traditions of the West insisted with relative unanimity that something in the person endures, the soul that persists through the changes of the body. The great traditions of the East divided over this question, with one tradition affirming an eternal and unchanging self at the deepest level of the person, and another denying that there is any permanent self at all, the disagreement between them being among the most profound in the entire history of human thought. The previous stage examined the Western frameworks, which located what is essential about the person in the enduring soul, the Greek psyche, and the Christian immortal soul, and the Jewish vital principle, frameworks that differed in their details, but that agreed in locating what is essential in a principle that endures through the changes of the body. The traditions of the East present a more divided picture, and the division runs precisely along the question that this investigation has been examining, the question of whether anything endures unchanged through the continuous flux. The Hindu tradition affirmed that beneath the changing body and the changing mind there is an eternal and unchanging self, the Atman, that is the deepest reality of the person, and that persists across the dissolution of countless bodies. The Buddhist tradition denied precisely this, holding that there is no permanent self of any kind, that the close examination of the person reveals not an eternal self, but only a stream of continuously arising and passing processes, the doctrine of anatta or non-self that stands at the very center of the Buddhist analysis. These two recognitions are not two ways of saying the same thing, and they must not be assimilated to each other, for they stand in direct and explicit contradiction, the one affirming exactly what the other denies. The eternal self that the Hindu tradition places at the foundation of reality, being precisely what the Buddhist tradition holds, does not exist. The temptation to harmonize them, to suppose that two such venerable traditions could not really disagree, that beneath their apparent opposition they must really be saying the same thing, is a temptation that does violence to both, each of which understood itself to be making a definite claim that the other denied, and this stage will honor the traditions by taking their disagreement seriously, rather than dissolving it into a false harmony. This stage will examine these two profoundly opposed frameworks, along with the Taoist framework that understood the self as a transformation within the broader patterns of the cosmos. The frameworks of the East that bear in their different ways on the question of what persists, if anything persists, through the continuous flux that this investigation has examined. The frameworks of the East are not, taken together, a single Eastern view to be set against a single Western view, but are themselves profoundly divided, the division among them being as significant for the question of what you are as any difference between East and West. The contemporary science has established that the self is in continuous flux, that the matter and the pattern and the felt continuity are all continuously changing, and it has located no permanent and unchanging self at the foundation of the person. The relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition of the self in flux and the opposed frameworks of the East, the Hindu eternal self and the Buddhist non-self, is striking and complex. The contemporary findings bearing differently on the two opposed frameworks, and any bridge between the science and either framework is a matter for reflection, rather than something that the science itself establishes. The contemporary science, in finding the self to be in continuous flux at every level and locating no permanent self, bears differently on the two opposed frameworks, seeming on its face to stand closer to the Buddhist denial of a permanent self than to the Hindu affirmation of an eternal self, though the matter is more complex than this first appearance suggests. Since the Hindu framework locates the eternal self not among the changing states that the science examines, but as the unchanging awareness that witnesses them, which the science, examining the changing states, would not be positioned to find even if it existed. The complexity of the relationship between the science and the two opposed frameworks is itself significant, and it must not be resolved too quickly in favor of either framework. The question of what the contemporary findings mean for the opposed frameworks being a matter for careful reflection that the synthesis will examine. The Hindu tradition articulated the framework of the Atman, the eternal and unchanging self that is the deepest reality of the person, across the long development of the philosophical and contemplative tradition. The framework holds that what you most truly are is not the body, which changes and dies, nor the mind, with its shifting thoughts and feelings, nor the personality, which develops and changes across the life, but the Atman, the eternal and unchanging awareness that underlies and witnesses all of these changing things, the deepest self that was never born and will never die, that persists not only through the changes of this life, but across the dissolution of countless bodies in the long succession of births and deaths. This eternal self is, on the Hindu framework, the most real thing about you, more real than the changing body and mind with which you ordinarily identify, the unchanging reality that the changing states obscure but never alter, the witness that remains the same through all the changes that it witnesses. The framework received its classic articulation in the Upanishads, the philosophical texts composed across the centuries in the middle of the first millennium before the Common Era, which articulated the Atman as the innermost self, distinct from the body and the senses and the mind, the unchanging witness of all the changing states of the person. The Upanishads approach the Atman through a process of progressive negation, distinguishing the innermost self from everything that changes, from the body that grows and ages, from the senses that come and go, from the mind with its shifting thoughts and feelings, arriving at the recognition that the innermost self is none of these changing things, but the unchanging awareness that witnesses them all. The teaching appears in the dialogue between the sage Yajnavalkya and his interlocutors, and in the instruction given to the young seeker Nachiketa by Yama, the Lord of Death, in the Katha Upanishad, which articulates the Atman as unborn and eternal, not slain when the body is slain, finer than the finest and greater than the greatest, the eternal self that dwells in the heart of every being. The Upanishads articulated the relationship between the Atman, the innermost self of the person, and Brahman, the ultimate reality that underlies the entire cosmos, with the most profound teaching of the tradition being the identity of the Atman and Brahman, the recognition that the innermost self of the person is identical with the ultimate reality of the cosmos, expressed in the great formula that thou art that. The framework held that the Atman is not the changing body, nor the changing senses, nor the changing mind, nor the changing stream of thoughts and feelings, but the unchanging awareness that witnesses all of these changing states, the awareness that remains the same through all the changes of the body and the mind, the eternal self that neither is born nor dies, but persists across the dissolution of countless bodies. The Hindu framework was developed with particular rigor in the school of Advaita Vedanta, articulated most influentially by the philosopher Shankara in approximately the 8th century of the Common Era, who articulated the Atman as the sole reality, the changing world being ultimately an appearance superimposed upon the unchanging reality of the self that is identical with Brahman. Shankara developed the framework through a rigorous analysis that distinguished the unchanging witness awareness from everything that it witnesses, arguing that the changing states of the body and the mind are objects of awareness, things that are known, while the Atman is the awareness itself, the knowing subject that can never be made into an object, the unchanging witness that is presupposed by all the changing states that it witnesses. The framework held that the ordinary identification of the self with the body and the mind is a fundamental error, a superimposition of the changing objects upon the unchanging witness, and that liberation consists in the recognition of the true self as the unchanging awareness that is identical with Brahman, distinct from all the changing states with which it had been mistakenly identified. The contemporary science has established that the matter and the pattern of the person are in continuous flux, and it has located no unchanging self of the kind that the Hindu tradition places at the foundation of the person, finding instead continuous change at every level that it can examine. The relationship between the Hindu framework of the eternal and unchanging Atman and the contemporary scientific recognition of the self in continuous flux is striking, even as the Hindu framework affirms an unchanging self, while the contemporary science finds continuous change at every level, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. There is a genuine question, which the synthesis will examine, of whether the unchanging witness awareness that the Hindu framework affirms is something that the contemporary science, examining the changing states, would even be positioned to find, since the framework locates the Atman not among the changing states, but as the awareness that witnesses them, the knowing subject rather than any of the known objects. The Buddhist tradition denied precisely what the Hindu tradition affirmed, holding that the close examination of the person reveals no permanent self of any kind, neither the changing body and mind, nor any unchanging self behind them, but only a stream of continuously arising and passing processes. The Buddhist tradition arose in the same broad cultural world as the Hindu tradition, sharing much of its vocabulary and many of its assumptions, including the framework of the succession of births and deaths and the aspiration to liberation from it. But it differed from the Hindu tradition on the most fundamental question, denying the eternal self that the Hindu tradition placed at the foundation of the person. The framework was articulated by the Buddha in the 5th century before the Common Era, in the teaching of anatta, or non-self, that stands at the very center of the Buddhist analysis of the person, the teaching that there is no permanent, unchanging, independent self to be found anywhere in the person. The teaching was, in the context of its origin, a direct challenge to the framework of the eternal Atman, the Buddha holding that the search for such a permanent self fails, that the close examination of the person reveals no such self, and that the clinging to the notion of a permanent self is the fundamental error that binds beings to suffering, rather than the liberating recognition that the Hindu tradition took it to be. The Buddhist analysis divided the person into 5 aggregates: the components of material form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, and held that the close examination of these aggregates reveals no permanent self, either among them or behind them, the person being constituted by the continuous interaction of these impermanent processes, without any permanent self that possesses them or stands behind them. The analysis examined each of the aggregates in turn and found each to be impermanent, continuously arising and passing, and found no permanent self to be identified with any of them, nor with their collection, nor with anything standing behind them. The conclusion being that the notion of a permanent self is an error, a designation mistakenly taken for a reality, the person being a process without a permanent self at its core. The Buddhist tradition articulated the analysis through the image of the chariot, which appears in the dialogue between the monk Nagasena and the king Milinda, the analysis observing that a chariot is not any one of its parts, nor the mere collection of its parts, nor anything apart from its parts. The word chariot being a designation that is applied to the parts arranged in a certain way, without there being any chariot essence over and above the parts. So too, the Buddhist analysis held, the self is not any one of the aggregates, nor the mere collection of them, nor anything apart from them. The word self being a designation applied to the aggregates without there being any permanent self over and above them. The Buddhist tradition held that the continuity across time, which the notion of a permanent self had been invoked to explain, is to be understood instead through dependent origination, the continuous arising of each state in dependence upon the preceding states, the stream of processes being continuous without any permanent self persisting through it, the way one flame lights another in succession without any permanent flame passing from one to the next. The image is precise and worth dwelling upon, since it captures how there can be genuine continuity without a permanent self. The way a flame passed from candle to candle through a long night is continuous, each flame arising in dependence upon the preceding one, while no permanent flame persists through the succession, each flame being a new flame that arises from the preceding one and passes in its turn. So too, on the Buddhist analysis, the person is continuous across time, each state arising in dependence upon the preceding states, while no permanent self persists through the succession, the continuity being the continuity of dependent arising, rather than the persistence of a permanent self. This is how the Buddhist tradition could deny the permanent self, while affirming the genuine continuity of the person across time, the continuity that the notion of a permanent self had been invoked to explain, being explained instead by the dependent arising of each state from the preceding states, without any permanent self that persists through the changes. The contemporary science has established that the close examination of the person reveals continuous change at every level, that the self is a continuously constructed process rather than a fixed thing, that no permanent and unchanging self can be located at the foundation of the person. The relationship between the Buddhist framework of non-self and the contemporary scientific recognition of the self as a continuously constructed process without a fixed foundation is striking. Even as the Buddhist framework articulates the absence of a permanent self in the terms of the contemplative analysis, while the contemporary science articulates it in the terms of the neuroscience and the psychology, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The Buddhist framework of non-self stands, of all the frameworks that the traditions have developed, the closest in its conclusion to the contemporary scientific recognition that the self is a continuously constructed process without a permanent foundation. Both the Buddhist analysis and the contemporary science finding, through their different methods, no permanent self at the foundation of the person, but only a stream of impermanent processes. The closeness of this convergence is striking. The Buddhist contemplative analysis and the contemporary scientific investigation arriving at the same recognition that there is no permanent self, that the person is a process rather than a fixed thing, that the search for an unchanging self at the foundation of the person fails, that the Buddhist tradition, through the contemplative analysis of the person into the impermanent aggregates, arrived at the denial of any permanent self, and that the contemporary science, through the neuroscience and the psychology, has arrived at the recognition of the self as a continuously constructed process without a fixed foundation, is a striking relationship, even as the two arrived at the recognition through entirely different methods, the one through contemplative analysis and the other through empirical investigation, and the relationship between them remains a matter for reflection. The depth of the disagreement between the Hindu and the Buddhist frameworks must not be obscured by any attempt to assimilate them to each other, for it is among the most profound disagreements in the entire history of human thought, and the two frameworks stand in direct and explicit contradiction on the most fundamental question about what the person is. This disagreement between the affirmation of an eternal self and the denial of any permanent self concerns the most fundamental question that can be asked about the person, the question of whether there is, at the deepest level, an enduring self at all, and the two traditions answer this question in directly opposite ways, the one affirming what the other denies. The Hindu tradition affirms an eternal and unchanging self, the Atman, at the very foundation of the person, the unchanging witness that persists through all the changes, and that is identical with the ultimate reality of the cosmos. The Buddhist tradition denies precisely this, holding that the search for such an unchanging self at the foundation of the person fails, that the close examination reveals no such self, but only the stream of impermanent processes, the very notion of a permanent self being, on the Buddhist analysis, the fundamental error that binds beings to suffering. For the Buddhist tradition, the belief in a permanent self is not merely a philosophical mistake, but the root of suffering, the clinging to a self that does not exist being the source of the craving and the aversion that bind beings to the cycle of suffering. The recognition of non-self being, therefore not merely a theoretical conclusion, but the liberating insight that releases beings from the suffering rooted in the illusion of self. For the Hindu tradition, by contrast, the recognition of the eternal Atman, far from being the error that binds beings to suffering, is the liberating recognition that releases the person from the false identification with the changing body and mind, the recognition of the true self as the eternal Atman, identical with Brahman, being the very liberation that the tradition seeks. Thus, the two traditions not only affirm and deny the eternal self, but assign opposite roles to the belief in it. The Hindu tradition treating the recognition of the eternal self as liberating, and the Buddhist tradition treating the belief in a permanent self as the very root of bondage, the opposition between the traditions running through the whole of their understanding of the person and its liberation. These are not two ways of saying the same thing, not two complementary perspectives on a single reality, not two paths up the same mountain, but two directly opposed claims about what the person is, the one affirming exactly what the other denies. The disagreement was not a minor matter for either tradition, but was the subject of extensive and rigorous philosophical debate across the centuries, with the Hindu and the Buddhist philosophers developing sophisticated arguments for their opposed positions and against the positions of the other, the debate being among the most rigorous and sustained in the history of philosophy. To collapse this disagreement into a vague perennial harmony, to suppose that the Atman and Anatta are merely two ways of pointing at the same ineffable reality, is to do violence to both traditions, each of which understood itself to be making a definite claim that contradicted the claim of the other, and neither of which would have accepted the assimilation of its position to the position it explicitly rejected. There is a persistent temptation, particularly in the modern encounter with these traditions, to suppose that all the contemplative traditions are ultimately saying the same thing, that the differences among them are merely differences of language or emphasis or cultural expression, that beneath the surface disagreements, they all point at the same ineffable reality. This temptation must be resisted, for it does violence to the traditions themselves, which understood their disagreements to be genuine and substantive rather than merely verbal, and which developed their positions precisely in opposition to the positions they rejected. The Hindu affirmation of the eternal Atman and the Buddhist denial of any permanent self are not two ways of saying the same thing, but two directly opposed claims, and the philosophers of the two traditions understood them so, debating them rigorously across the centuries as genuine disagreements about what the person is, not as complementary expressions of a single truth. To honor the traditions is to take their disagreements seriously, to recognize that they cannot all be right, that the eternal self either exists or does not, that the question of what the person is admits of genuinely opposed answers, among which the traditions genuinely differ. The contemporary science, for its part, finds continuous change at every level and locates no permanent self, a finding that bears differently on the two opposed frameworks, and the relationship between the science and the two frameworks is a matter for careful reflection that must not paper over the genuine and profound disagreement between the frameworks themselves. The Taoist tradition approached the question differently from both the Hindu and the Buddhist frameworks, understanding the self not as an eternal, unchanging reality, nor through the rigorous analysis of its components, but as a transformation within the broader patterns of the cosmos, the self being one of the countless transformations of the Tao. The Tao, the way or the course of nature, the underlying pattern according to which all things arise and change and pass, is the ultimate reality of the Taoist framework, and the self is understood as one of its countless transformations, arising from the Tao and returning to it as one of the endless changes through which the Tao expresses itself. The framework does not affirm an eternal self that persists unchanged, nor does it undertake the rigorous analysis of the person into impermanent components, but understands the self as a natural transformation within the continuous flux of the Tao, neither clinging to a permanent self nor analyzing the self away, but accepting the self as one of the natural transformations of the cosmos. The framework was articulated in the foundational texts of the Taoist tradition, particularly in the writings associated with the philosopher Zhuangzi in approximately the 4th century before the Common Era, which approached the question of the self and its transformations through parable and paradox rather than through systematic analysis. Zhuangzi articulated the famous parable of the butterfly dream, in which he dreamed he was a butterfly and, upon waking, could not be certain whether he was a man who had dreamed he was a butterfly or a butterfly now dreaming he was a man, the parable suggesting the fluidity of the boundaries of the self and the difficulty of establishing any fixed foundation for it. The parable does not resolve into a definite doctrine about the self, but holds open the question, suggesting that the boundaries we take to be fixed, the boundary between the waking self and the dreaming self, the boundary between one form of life and another, are more fluid than we suppose, the self being one of the transformations of the Tao rather than a fixed thing with definite boundaries. Zhuangzi approached even death as one of the transformations of the Tao, recounting how he was found singing after the death of his wife, explaining that her death was a transformation no different from the transformations of the seasons, the self arising from the Tao and returning to it through transformations that are as natural as the turning of the seasons and that are not to be grieved as the loss of a fixed and permanent self. The account relates how a friend, finding Zhuangzi singing and drumming on a basin shortly after his wife's death, reproached him for his apparent lack of grief, and how Zhuangzi explained that he had at first grieved as anyone would, but had come to recognize that his wife's death was a transformation, no different in kind from the transformations through which she had come to be, that just as the seasons turn from spring to summer to autumn to winter, his wife had now undergone a transformation back into the great process of the Tao, and that to weep and wail over this natural transformation would be to misunderstand the nature of things. The framework understood the self as a transformation within the broader patterns of the cosmos, arising from the Tao and returning to it, neither a permanent unchanging self, nor merely a collection of impermanent processes, but a transformation within the continuous flux of the Tao. The contemporary science has established that the person is in continuous transformation, that the matter and the pattern are continuously changing, that the self is a process within the broader processes of nature. The relationship between the Taoist framework of the self as a transformation within the patterns of the cosmos and the contemporary scientific recognition of the person as a process within the processes of nature is striking, even as the Taoist framework articulates the transformation in the terms of the Tao, while the contemporary science articulates it in the terms of the natural processes, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The Taoist framework occupies a distinctive position among the frameworks of the traditions, neither affirming an eternal self as the Hindu tradition does, nor undertaking the rigorous analysis into impermanent components as the Buddhist tradition does, but understanding the self as a natural transformation within the continuous flux of the Tao, the self arising from the Tao and returning to it as naturally as the seasons turn. This understanding of the self as a natural transformation within the broader patterns of nature bears a certain resemblance to the contemporary scientific recognition of the person as a process within the broader processes of nature, both understanding the self not as a thing set apart from nature, but as one of nature's transformations, arising from the natural processes and returning to them. That the Taoist tradition understood the self as a transformation within the patterns of the Tao, and that the contemporary science has found the person to be a process within the processes of nature, is a striking relationship, even as the Taoist framework articulates the transformation in the terms of the Tao, and the science articulates it in the terms of the natural processes, and the relationship between them remains a matter for reflection. The investigation will conclude in the final stage with the synthesis of all that it has explored, the contemporary science of the changing self and the profoundly opposed frameworks of the traditions, into a reflection on what the convergences and the genuine differences might mean for the question of what you are. The final stage will bring together the contemporary science that finds the self in continuous flux at every level, the Western frameworks that locate what is essential in the enduring soul, and the Eastern frameworks that divide between the affirmation of the eternal self and the denial of any permanent self, into a synthesis that examines the threads that have run through the investigation, the genuine objections and difficulties, and what all of it might mean for the question of what persists through the continuous replacement and reconstruction that the investigation has examined. The synthesis will not attempt to dissolve the genuine disagreements among the frameworks into a false harmony, nor to declare that the contemporary science has settled the question in favor of one framework or another, but will examine honestly what the convergences and the genuine differences might mean, holding open the question of what you are rather than closing it with a false resolution. The recognition that the great traditions of the East divided over the very question of whether anything in the person endures, the Hindu tradition affirming the eternal and unchanging Atman, the Buddhist tradition denying any permanent self, the Taoist tradition understanding the self as a transformation within the Tao, the disagreement between the Hindu and the Buddhist frameworks being among the most profound in the history of thought, is the recognition that this stage has explored. You are a letter being rewritten, and the traditions of the East divided over whether there is a permanent text beneath the rewriting. The Hindu tradition affirming an eternal text that the rewriting never touches. The Buddhist tradition denying any permanent text and finding only the continuous rewriting itself, and the question of what you are, of whether there is a permanent text or only the rewriting, is the question that the final stage will bring together. The Hindu tradition would say that beneath the rewriting of the material and the words there is an eternal text, the Atman, that the rewriting never touches, the unchanging meaning that the changing letter expresses but never alters. The Buddhist tradition would say that there is no such permanent text, that the search for an unchanging text beneath the rewriting fails, that there is only the continuous rewriting itself, the letter being the rewriting rather than any permanent text that the rewriting expresses. The Taoist tradition would say that the rewriting is itself one of the transformations of the Tao, the letter arising and changing and passing as naturally as the seasons turn, neither a permanent text nor merely a meaningless succession, but a natural transformation within the great process of the whole. These are genuinely different answers to the question of what you are, and the final stage will bring them together with the contemporary science, holding open the question rather than closing it with a false resolution. The investigation continues. The child you remember being is dead, and you have spent this entire investigation discovering in how many ways this is true. When the investigation began, this claim might have seemed a mere provocation, a striking way of speaking that would be softened as the investigation proceeded. But the investigation has not softened it. It has deepened it, showing in how many ways the child you remember being is gone, not in one way, but in several. The matter and the pattern and the felt continuity, each having been found to be in flux, each finding adding to the recognition with which the investigation began. The matter that constituted that child has been entirely replaced, flushed out, and rebuilt, so that almost nothing of that child's body remains in the body reading these words. The pattern that organized the matter has been continuously modified, the connections among the neurons reshaped by everything experienced and learned, so that the pattern that is you now is not the pattern that was that child. And the felt continuity that seemed to connect you to that child, the sense of being the same person grown up, has been found to be itself a construction, a narrative that the brain continuously tells, woven from memories that are themselves continuously reconstructed. At every level the investigation examined, the self was found to be in flux, the matter and the pattern and the felt continuity all continuously changing, with no fixed self that the contemporary science could locate beneath the flux. And against this finding the great traditions of the West and the East set their frameworks. The Western insistence on the enduring soul, the Hindu affirmation of the eternal self, the Buddhist denial of any permanent self, the Taoist understanding of the self as a transformation, frameworks that bear differently on the finding and that differ profoundly from one another. This final stage will bring together all that the investigation has explored, drawing out the threads that have run through it, articulating honestly the objections and difficulties that any conclusion must face, and reflecting on what all of it might mean for the question of what you are, while leaving that question open rather than closing it with a false resolution. The investigation has examined 4 threads: the replacement of the matter, the modification of the pattern, the construction of the narrative, and the question of what persists through all of these, and this synthesis will draw the 4 threads together before turning to the objections and to the genuine possibilities among which you must find your own way. The investigation has not aimed to tell you what to conclude, to deliver a verdict on the deepest question about what you are, but to lay out honestly what the contemporary science has established and what the great traditions have held, the convergences and the genuine differences, so that you might find your own way through the question with the science and the traditions before you. The contemporary science establishes the flux of the self at every level it can examine, and it locates no permanent self beneath the flux, even as it does not establish that there is no permanent self, only that it can find none. The traditions set against this, their frameworks of the soul and the eternal self and the non-self and the transformation, and the relationship between the contemporary science and the frameworks of the traditions is striking. Even as the traditions differ profoundly from one another and from the science, and any bridge between the science and any of the traditions is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The question that this investigation has examined connects to questions that other investigations have explored. The question of what persists through change being one of the deepest and most recurrent in the examination of the self and the cosmos. The investigation into the nature of time and whether the self persists through it. The investigation into memory and whether the remembered self is the self that was. The investigation into the dissolution of the boundaries between selves. The investigation into what happens to the self at death. All bear on the question that this investigation has examined, the question of what you are beneath the continuous change. Each of these investigations approaches from a different direction, the single deep question of what the self is and whether it endures, and the recognitions of this investigation, that the matter is replaced and the pattern modified and the narrative constructed, connect to the recognitions of those other investigations, the question of what persists through the replacement of the matter, being one face of the larger question of what the self is and whether anything of it endures through the changes that time brings. The recognition that the self is in continuous flux, that the matter and the pattern and the narrative are all continuously changing, connects to the recognition in other investigations that the apparent fixity of things conceals a continuous process, that the world is less a collection of fixed things than a continuous flux of processes, the self being one instance of the deeper truth that what appears fixed is in continuous change. The first thread that has run through the investigation is the replacement of the matter, the recognition that the material substance of the body is continuously exchanged so that almost nothing of the body of years ago remains. This was the recognition with which the investigation began, the recognition that the child you remember being is, at the level of the matter, gone. The atoms that constituted that child dispersed and replaced, the body rebuilt from new material across the years. It is the most concrete of the threads, the most directly established by the contemporary science, the replacement of the matter being a matter of measurement rather than interpretation, the rates of turnover of the various tissues having been determined with precision. The contemporary science established this through the work of Jonas Frisén at the Karolinska Institute, whose carbon-14 dating of human cells established that the cells of the body are far younger than the person, and through the work of Rudolf Schoenheimer at Columbia in the 1930s, whose isotope tracing established the continuous turnover of the molecules of the body. The picture that this science established is one of relentless turnover, the cells of the gut replaced in days, the cells of the skin in weeks, the red blood cells in months, even the skeleton substantially replaced across the span of a decade, the matter of the body continuously carried away and replaced, so that the body is, at the level of its material substance, a different body than it was. The traditions recognize the changing nature of the body, the impermanence of the material form, the recognition that the body is a thing that arises and changes and passes rather than a fixed possession. This recognition runs through the contemplative traditions, which counseled the recognition of the body as impermanent, a thing in constant change rather than a fixed and permanent possession, the attachment to the body as the permanent self being a misidentification of the changing for the permanent. The relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition of the continuous replacement of the matter and the traditional recognition of the impermanence of the body is striking. Even as the science articulates the replacement in the terms of the cellular and molecular turnover, while the traditions articulate the impermanence in the terms of the changing nature of the material form, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that the matter is replaced establishes that the self, if it is anything, is not the specific matter, which is continuously exchanged, so that the question of what you are becomes the question of what persists through the replacement of the matter, the first thread leading to the second. If you are not the specific atoms which have been entirely replaced, then you must be something that persists through the replacement of the atoms, something other than the matter, and the natural candidate is the pattern, the arrangement that is preserved through the replacement of the material, the second thread that the investigation took up. The second thread is the modification of the pattern, the recognition that what is essential about you is not the matter but the pattern, and that the pattern itself is continuously modified rather than fixed. When the matter was found to be replaced, the pattern seemed to offer a refuge, the place where the enduring self might be located, since the pattern can in principle be preserved through the replacement of the matter that carries it. But the investigation found that the pattern itself is in flux, continuously modified by experience, continuously reconstructed by the activity of the brain, so that the refuge that the pattern seemed to offer proved illusory, the pattern being no more fixed than the matter. The contemporary science established this through the recognition that information is separable from the material substrate, articulated through the work of Claude Shannon at Bell Laboratories in 1948, and through the recognition that the pattern of the brain is continuously reshaped by experience, established through the work of Eric Kandel at Columbia, whose research on the cellular mechanisms of memory earned the Nobel Prize in 2000. The recognition that what is essential is the pattern rather than the matter seemed at first to offer a refuge for the enduring self, since the pattern can in principle be preserved through the replacement of the matter, the way a melody is preserved through the replacement of the instruments that play it. But the refuge proved illusory, since the pattern itself was found to be in continuous flux, the connections among the neurons continuously reshaped by experience, the self continuously constructed by the ongoing activity of the brain, so that the pattern offered no fixed point any more than the matter did. The traditions recognize that what is essential about the person is the form or the organizing principle rather than the specific matter. The Aristotelian framework of the soul as the form of the body, standing particularly close to the contemporary recognition of the pattern as the organizing principle. The relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition of the pattern as the organizing principle and the traditional recognition of the form or the soul as the organizing principle is striking, even as the science finds the pattern itself to be in flux, while the traditions tended to treat the soul as enduring, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that the pattern is modified establishes that the self, if it is anything, is not a fixed pattern, since the pattern is continuously reshaped, so that the question of what you are becomes the question of what persists through the modification of the pattern, the second thread leading to the third. If you are not a fixed pattern, since the pattern is continuously reshaped, then perhaps you are the felt continuity that persists through the changes of the pattern, the sense of being the same person that remains unbroken through the modifications of the matter and the pattern alike, the continuity that seemed to survive all the changes. The third thread that the investigation took up. The third thread is the construction of the narrative, the recognition that the felt continuity of the self is itself a construction, a story that the brain continuously tells. When the matter was found to be replaced and the pattern to be modified, the felt continuity of the self seemed to be the one thing that endured, the sense of being the same person that remained unbroken through all the changes, the last candidate for the enduring self. But the investigation found that this felt continuity is itself constructed, a narrative that the brain continuously tells, woven from memories that are themselves continuously reconstructed, so that even the felt continuity, the last refuge of the enduring self, was found to be produced rather than given. The contemporary science established this through the recognition of the self as a center of narrative gravity, articulated by Dennett at Tufts in 1991, through the recognition of the malleability of memory, established by Elizabeth Loftus at the University of California, Irvine, and through the recognition that memory is continuously reconstructed, established by Karim Nader at McGill, whose research on reconsolidation was published in Nature in 2000. This was the most disturbing of the threads, since it struck at the felt continuity that had survived the replacement of the matter and the modification of the pattern, the sense of being a continuous self that had seemed the one thing that endured through all the changes. The recognition that this felt continuity is itself a construction, a story that the brain tells, woven from memories that are themselves continuously reconstructed, left no refuge for the enduring self, the very continuity that seemed most certain being found to be produced rather than given. The traditions recognized that the self is in some sense a construction, that the sense of being a fixed and continuous self is produced rather than simply given, the recognition that the contemplative traditions developed through the close examination of the self. The relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition of the self as a constructed narrative and the contemplative recognition of the self as a construction is striking. Even as the science articulates the construction in the terms of the narrative activity of the brain, while the traditions articulate it in the terms of the constructed nature of the self, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that the narrative is constructed establishes that even the felt continuity of the self, which seemed the last refuge of the enduring self, is itself produced rather than given, so that the question of what you are becomes the question of what, if anything, persists beneath the construction, the third thread leading to the fourth. With the recognition that the felt continuity is itself constructed, the search for an enduring self among the things the science can examine had been exhausted. The matter and the pattern and the felt continuity all having been found to be in flux, and the question of what persists beneath all of this, of whether anything persists at all, became the fourth thread, the question that the traditions had answered in their profoundly different ways. The fourth thread is the question that the first three raise, and that the traditions answered in their profoundly different ways, the question of what persists, if anything persists, through the replacement of the matter and the modification of the pattern and the construction of the narrative. The contemporary science finds the self in flux at every level it can examine and locates no permanent self beneath the flux, but it does not thereby establish that there is no permanent self, only that it can find none through the methods available to it. This distinction is crucial and must not be elided, for there is a difference between finding no permanent self and establishing that there is none, the science having done the former but not the latter. The science examines the matter and the patterns of activity, the things that can be observed and measured, and it finds these to be in flux, but whether there is, beyond what can be observed and measured, an enduring self of the kind that some of the traditions affirm, is a question that the science is not positioned to settle, since such a self, if it existed, would not be among the things that the science examines. The traditions answered the question in their different ways, the Western traditions affirming the enduring soul, the Hindu tradition affirming the eternal Atman, the Buddhist tradition denying any permanent self, the Taoist tradition understanding the self as a transformation within the patterns of the cosmos. These answers differ profoundly from one another, and the difference between the Hindu affirmation of the eternal self and the Buddhist denial of any permanent self is among the most profound disagreements in the history of human thought, not to be dissolved into a false harmony, but to be honoured as a genuine disagreement about the deepest question. It must be said plainly, as the investigation reaches its synthesis, that these frameworks cannot all be correct, that the enduring soul either exists or does not, that the eternal self either underlies the person or does not, that the question of what you are admits of genuinely opposed answers, among which the traditions genuinely differ. The temptation to gather all the traditions into a vague harmony, to suppose that they are all ultimately saying the same thing, must be resisted to the end, for it does violence to the traditions themselves, which understood their disagreements to be genuine, and which would not accept the dissolution of their distinct claims into a common essence that none of them affirmed. The relationship between the contemporary scientific finding of the flux and the profoundly different answers of the traditions is striking, even as the traditions differ profoundly from one another, and the science establishes none of their answers, and any bridge between the science and any of the answers is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The fourth thread is the question itself, the question of what you are beneath the flux, the question that the investigation has examined without closing. This fourth thread is not a finding like the other three, but the question that the other three raise, the question that remains after the matter and the pattern and the narrative have all been found to be in flux, the question of whether there is anything beneath the flux and, if there is, what it might be. It is the question that the traditions answered in their profoundly different ways and that the contemporary science leaves open, the question that each person must take up for themselves, the question that the investigation has aimed not to close but to clarify, laying out what the science has established and what the traditions have held, so that the question might be taken up with the honesty it deserves. Several objections must be stated honestly before the investigation reaches its close, since intellectual honesty requires that the difficulties facing any conclusion be acknowledged rather than concealed. It would be easy, having traced the four threads to the recognition that the science can find no permanent self, to conclude that there is no permanent self, that the matter is settled, that the disturbance is the simple truth. But this conclusion would move too quickly, would claim more than the investigation has established, would mistake the failure of the science to find a permanent self for the demonstration that there is none. The objections that follow do not establish that there is a permanent self, but they establish that the question remains open, that the recognition of the flux does not settle the deepest question, that the honest conclusion is not a verdict but an open question that each person must take up for themselves. The first objection holds that the recognition that the self is in flux does not establish that there is no enduring self. Since the contemporary science examines the changing states of the body and the mind, and would not be positioned to detect an enduring self of the kind that some of the traditions affirm, an enduring soul or an unchanging witness awareness that is not among the changing states but is presupposed by them, so that the failure of the science to find an enduring self may reflect the limits of its methods rather than the absence of such a self. The science examines what can be observed and measured, the matter and the patterns of activity, and it finds these to be in flux. But the enduring self that some of the traditions affirm is not among the things that can be observed and measured, being the witness rather than the witnessed, the subject rather than any object, so that the science, examining the objects, would not find the subject even if it existed, and its failure to find an enduring self is therefore not decisive against the traditions that affirm one. The second objection holds that the recognition that the self is a construction does not establish that the self is unreal or unimportant, since many things that are constructed are nonetheless real and important. A constructed thing being real as a construction, even if it is not the fixed and independent reality that ordinary thinking takes it to be, so that the recognition of the self as a construction need not be the devastating loss that it might first appear, but may be compatible with the self being real and important in the way that matters for living. A symphony is constructed, assembled from notes that have no music in themselves, and yet the symphony is real and beautiful and important. It's being constructed taking nothing away from its reality, and the self, even if it is constructed, may be real and significant in the same way, its construction taking nothing away from the reality and significance that it has for the living of a life. The love you bear for others, the work you have done, the person you have become, are real and significant, regardless of whether the self that bears the love and does the work and becomes the person is a fixed thing or a construction, the reality and significance of a life not depending on the metaphysical status of the self that lives it. The third objection holds that the genuine continuity of the person across time, the continuity that connects you to the child you were through an unbroken chain of gradual change, is itself a real and significant fact, regardless of whether there is a permanent self beneath the change, so that the question of personal identity may be less about whether there is a permanent self than about the character of the continuity that connects the successive states, the continuity being real and significant, even if no permanent self persists through it. These objections do not resolve the question of what you are, but they establish that the recognition of the flux need not lead to the conclusion that there is no self, or that the self is unreal, the question remaining genuinely open. The flux is real, established by the contemporary science beyond serious doubt, the matter replaced, and the pattern modified, and the narrative constructed. But what the flux means for the question of what you are, whether it shows that there is no enduring self, or whether the enduring self lies deeper than the flux that the science examines, whether the constructed self is unreal, or is real as a construction, whether the continuity that connects you to the child you were is significant in itself, or only as the trace of a permanent self, are questions that the flux does not settle, questions that remain open after the science has established all that it can establish. The honest conclusion of the investigation is therefore not a verdict on what you are, but a clarification of the question, a recognition of what the science has established and what it has left open, so that you might take up the open question with the genuine possibilities before you. What you make of all this is yours alone to determine, and the investigation closes not by telling you what to conclude, but by laying out the genuine possibilities among which you must find your own way. The investigation has not been a path to a predetermined conclusion, a demonstration designed to lead you to a particular view of what you are. It has been an examination of what the contemporary science has established and what the great traditions have held, and it leaves you, at its close, with the genuine possibilities before you, the possibilities that the science and the traditions present, among which you must find your own way, the investigation having no authority to decide for you the deepest question about what you are. There are, broadly, 3 ways that one might take up the recognitions that the investigation has examined. 3 genuine possibilities that correspond to the great frameworks that the traditions developed, and the investigation will lay out these 3 before leaving the question with you. You might conclude, with the Buddhist tradition, and with much of the contemporary science, that there is no permanent self beneath the flux, that the self is a continuously constructed process without a fixed foundation, and that the recognition of this, far from being a cause for despair, is a liberation from the clinging to a self that was never there, opening onto a freer and more open way of being. On this view, the disturbance that the investigation has produced is the beginning of a liberation. The recognition that the self one had taken to be a fixed thing, to be defended and clung to, is more open and more fluid than it had seemed. The recognition releasing the grip of the clinging that is, on the Buddhist analysis, the root of suffering. The fear that the recognition of no permanent self might at first provoke the vertigo of finding no fixed self beneath the flux gives way, on this view, to a kind of release. The recognition that there was never a fixed self to lose, that the clinging to such a self was itself the source of much suffering, and that its relaxation opens onto a freer and lighter way of being, no longer defending a self that was never there. You might conclude, with the Western traditions and the Hindu tradition, that beneath the flux that the science establishes there is an enduring principle that the science cannot detect, a soul or an eternal self that is not among the changing states, but is presupposed by them, the science finding only flux because it examines only the changing states, while the enduring self lies deeper than its methods can reach. On this view, the flux that the science establishes is real but is not the whole truth. The changing matter and the changing pattern and the constructed narrative being the surface beneath which the enduring self abides, the soul, or the Atman, that the science cannot reach, but that the traditions affirm on other grounds. You might conclude, with the Taoist tradition, that the question of whether there is a permanent self is less important than the recognition that you are one of the transformations of the great process of nature, arising from it and returning to it as naturally as the seasons turn, the self being neither a permanent thing to cling to, nor a mere illusion to see through, but a natural transformation to be accepted. On this view, the disturbance dissolves not into a doctrine about the self, but into a way of holding the question lightly, accepting the self as one of the transformations of the whole, neither grasping after permanence, nor recoiling from impermanence, but moving with the great process of which the self is a passing expression. The seasons do not grieve their turning, and the Taoist way is to move with the transformations of the self as the year moves through its seasons, neither clinging to spring nor dreading winter, but accepting each transformation as natural, the self being one of the countless transformations of the Tao, arising and changing and returning as naturally as everything else that the great process brings forth and takes back. These are genuinely different conclusions, and the investigation does not decide among them, leaving the decision to you. The science has established the flux, and the traditions have offered their frameworks, and the genuine possibilities lie before you. The Buddhist and scientific recognition of no permanent self, the Western and Hindu affirmation of an enduring self that the science cannot reach, the Taoist acceptance of the self as a transformation of the whole. Which of these you make your own, or whether you hold the question open without deciding, is yours alone to determine. The investigation having aimed not to decide for you, but to lay the question before you, with the honesty it deserves. The science cannot decide it for you, having established the flux but not what the flux means for the deepest question. The traditions cannot decide it for you, offering their profoundly different frameworks among which you must choose or from which you must abstain. The decision, if there is to be one, is yours, taken up in the light of all that the science has established and all that the traditions have held. The question of what you are being, in the end, a question that each person must answer for themselves or hold open as their own. You are a letter being rewritten, the material continuously replaced, the words continuously rewritten, the continuity written into the rewriting itself, and whether there is, beneath all the rewriting, a permanent text that the rewriting expresses, an enduring meaning that does not change, or whether there is only the rewriting itself, is the question that this investigation has examined and that you must answer for yourself. The child you remember being is dead. The matter is gone. The pattern is changed. The continuity is a story. And yet here you are, reading these words, feeling yourself to be someone. The question of what that someone is remaining, after all the investigation, genuinely and profoundly open. What you make of it is yours alone to determine.